returning to Michigan State University for my final year, I was invited to participate in a research expedition to the Stora Sjöfallet Mire in northern Sweden. The Arctic Collaboratory had already provided funding, so Roger Dawson and I immediately set off for the Arctic by plane in early May. While transferring in Stockholm, we connected with Professor Helen from the local university. After arriving at the final destination, we met our guide, Camilla, again. It really has been a long journey, flying back and forth, hasn't it? But the real journey is just beginning. After we rested, we drove into the Arctic Circle the next day, this 700,000-acre wetland. Camilla told us, if we assume it's under optimal conditions, that is, excluding factors like sleep, food, terrain, weather, and so on, we would still need about 11 days to cross. For this arduous journey, we were well prepared. It's just that walking here, looking at every view along the way, it really feels like the Dead Marshes from The Lord of the Rings. The scenes in the movie of the Dead Marshes still make me feel that Dorsey and I definitely didn't bring enough gear. May in northern Sweden is a very strange time of year. Strictly speaking, it is still considered spring, but it can occasionally drop below 0 degrees Celsius. Not only is the temperature challenging us, but the weather is also unpredictable. It's so hot in the afternoon that I'm sweating. Yet, frost can appear in the morning. This huge temperature difference means we have to change our clothes every so often. We have to change clothes frequently. This constant adjusting reduces our efficiency. But we won't hesitate because of this. The further north we drive, the surrounding natural landscape became increasingly monotonous. It was reduced to nothing but moss, bushes, and slender branches. I remember it was the evening of the 4th day after our departure. Camilla was driving. Helen was sitting in the passenger seat, looking at data on her computer. Suddenly she turned to Dawson and me and said, "Professors, I estimate that tonight, we will be entering the indigenous people's territory. I hope that tomorrow, in addition to looking for specimens, you can also help me solve some environmental science problems. Is that okay?" I finished the last piece of candy. Ask about indigenous environmental science. I don't remember you mentioning that you had a project on this topic. Dawson slapped me, said, "Didn't you check the group chat, Tom?" Helen mentioned that just 3 months ago, the indigenous Sami people suddenly moved their reindeer in large numbers further north, claiming that the wetland imposed by ST had caused severe soil and water issues in the Midwest. Animals were poisoned, and birds migrated south, mass fish deaths and so on and so forth. I gave a perfunctory, "Oh," because that's not within my research scope. Then Helen closed her laptop. She said she'd appreciate our help then. The Swedish local government is still quite concerned about the indigenous people's situation. They are. Because of the previous situation in the Aurora area of Alaska, there have been poison gas leaks, and disappearances of large numbers of people in Inuit villages. Residents have disappeared on a large scale. I asked again, "So when will we arrive at the Sami village?" She turned and pointed ahead. "It seems we're already here." The car has entered a rural lane. There aren't many houses here, but the facilities are more modern than we had imagined. It's like a hidden paradise in the polar swamps. I can't understand how people can live in such an isolated, remote place. I also can't understand why a perfectly good village, now, there isn't a single person in sight. Although all the Sami people mysteriously left, we are still very much following the rules. We found the rental house at the end of the gravel road. After a few days of exhausting driving, we finally got to lie on a soft bed. It felt so good to sleep comfortably through the night. We went to bed quite early that night. I woke up very early the next day. By around 5:30 in the morning, everyone was already ready to go, but I seemed to be especially out of place. It took me quite some time to get used to the strange atmosphere around me, the native land of the Sami people. In the morning, there was a slightly familiar scent in the air. The air was also filled with insects, the buzzing of wings and the calls of birds. The biggest contrast to this atmosphere is the flowers within several miles that have all withered and died, along with the insects and animals that have either died or migrated. What the Sami people said was right. This indeed shows a phenomenon where life is uninhabitable, but our intuition tells us it's not just a simple environmental issue. Helen, however, was full of enthusiasm, leading the rest of us into the forest without a canopy. With the sun above our heads, singing local folk songs, we ventured deeper into the swamp. There are many very cute animals here. She suddenly spoke. "Look." We leaned forward, following where she pointed on the ground, but we didn't see anything. Camilla suddenly responded. Professor Helen, did you not sleep well? Cloudberry is a plant, not an animal, right? She gave a wry smile, shook her head, and said, you don't believe me. After a while, you'll see it. More lively Arctic animals are in the forest now. We continue to follow the orange markers, heading deeper into the forest, guided by the conspicuous cloudberries. When we reach the designated third point, we can finally pull our legs out of the muck. Time to pack up. We'll sit in the forest without a canopy. Going through the specimens and records we've collected along the way, the afternoon sun bathed us in its unrestrained warmth. Warm and comfortable, even slightly cozy. But suddenly, Dawson hurried back from the mud, saying that the three of us had a strange incident. All the markers we placed are gone. Camilla quickly got up from the ground, fully alert. She looked around. She kept muttering, they really are gone. This is strange. She looked up at Dawson and asked, what about the cloudberries? We placed them along the cloudberries. That was our second layer of insurance. But the result wasn't satisfactory. When we tried to retrace our steps based on memory, let alone cloudberries, any low-lying plants with distinctive colors and appearances, had all vanished without a trace. We looked at each other, speechless, and returned to location 3. Camilla warned us not to leave. Now the night begins. We'll set up camp here first. Tomorrow morning we'll figure out how to get back to the village. By the time we finished setting up the tents, it was already past 8 p.m. There's almost no signal here. We can only keep comforting ourselves. Don't worry, there's nothing more we can do for now. Just carefully check and organize the rich findings from the past few days of investigation. When it was almost time for everyone to sleep, I suddenly realized I had forgotten to set up the mosquito repellent light. Spending the night in the forest would result in getting bitten all over. I quickly grabbed 3 lights and crawled out of the tent. At that moment, the forest was completely silent. Surprisingly quiet. No birds singing. Even the branches stopped rustling. But it felt like something had appeared in my view. When I set up a lamp, I realized that in the campsite right in front of me, a reindeer was standing in the swamp. Because it wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen. It stood motionless for over 10 minutes, just standing there. I actually thought it was a tree. I don't know why a deer would suddenly appear in the middle of the swamp. I just felt a strange, inexplicable unease. I quickly returned to my tent. I didn't sleep a wink that night. The next day, when I was packing up the tent, I found the reindeer were gone. However, I still told Camilla. She told me that reindeer are easily startled. So seeing unusual lights in the forest at night, standing far away and watching, motionless, is quite normal. But it wasn't fully explained yet. Suddenly, a sharp scream tore through the sky. It was the loudest noise I had heard in days. It sounded like the cry of a large bird. Helen was the first to grab the gear. Someone is calling for help. She was right. The cries rise and fall, but never cease. It's like someone in the forest, desperately screaming for help. We put on our boots and step into the swamp. Following the sound, we walk on. The sound never stopped. Until about half an hour later, the screaming suddenly stopped completely. We had almost reached Site 4. But still hadn't seen any survivors. Let's just detour. After checking the natural conditions at Site 4, we should head back to Camp 3. Don't take that scream to heart. This time, we were lucky. No landmark disappeared. By noon that day, we successfully returned to the campsite at Site 3, but blocking the final stretch of the road was a towering tree that had suddenly appeared. A tree that could almost only be found in tropical regions. Only large trees can be seen here. Hanging from the tree are a bunch of reindeer corpses. They seem to have been hanging there for a long time. The antlers tangled in the branches are already tattered. The flesh on them has dried out. The broken hooves of the reindeer still sway back and forth in the gentle breeze, striking each other. It's like a wind chime of extreme bad taste. Helen hesitated, reaching for her phone to take a picture. But seeing Camilla's nervous expression, she put it down again. Dawson's eyes never left Camilla. He waited for the guide's scientific explanation. Finally, Camilla spoke. Bears hide their prey in the forest. Dawson was clearly not satisfied with the answer. Is this supposed to be hidden prey? It seems more like showing off the hunt's results. Camilla waved her hand and walked out of the swamp. It seemed like she had nothing to respond with. We followed one after another. I, at the back. noticed. There were some unusual marks on the bark of that large tree. Apart from the hoof prints, there are many patterns rich in regularity. We can't take that risk, especially if we suspect there might be bears in the forest. In this situation, we must try to find the way back first. So, at 2 p.m., the four of us started looking for the path covered in cloudberries, the road to the Sammy's original village. But just after walking a mile, we heard that scream again. This time, the sound came from two different directions, one from the northeast. Camilla was obviously getting anxious. She said, "Remember what I told you, don't pay attention to that sound. That's definitely birdsong. It's normal for birds to make mating calls in spring." Helen immediately retorted, "How is that possible? That clearly sounds like two people calling for help. LP hell. Can't you tell? Professor Helen, please try to be rational." Camilla is a little angry. Could it be that there's a pair of identical twins who are both in distress in two different places, and are asking us for help? But you should know that birds are not able to make the sounds L and P. At least, none that I know of. This back and forth argument is getting us nowhere. In the end, we stayed firm with the rules we set at the beginning. Safety is the most important. When opinions differ, we always follow the guide. However, after an afternoon of traveling, we did not find the original village. Instead, we arrived at location 6. The argument became more intense. Even Dawson began to question Camilla. Endless bickering. My mind was full of doubts, because I kept feeling that, as we walked along, the forest we passed through had not only intersecting tree branches, but also some deer antlers mixed in. Besides that, images keep surfacing in my mind, of two people trapped in a swamp, calling out for our help. They won't be able to wait for us. They'll slowly sink into the wetlands. It's terrifying. Wait, no. This isn't what I should be thinking about right now. I should hurry up and go break up the argument between the three of them. Then suggest we temporarily set up camp on the high ground of Area 6. We've been so exhausted these past 2 days. Physically and mentally drained. Maybe we should rest first. Then think of another way to return to the city. They all agreed. My idea wasn't wrong. At least I am truly exhausted, both physically and mentally. That night, I hadn't gone through any of the materials and quickly fell asleep. However, in the middle of the night, Dawson gently woke me up. He put his finger to his lips, motioning for me to be quiet. Then he put his hand to my ear, signaling me to listen carefully. It was undoubtedly that same sound again. This time, we were closer to it. I immediately got dressed and followed Dawson out. I found Camilla and Helen were already up, crowded together on the edge of the highland and the mire, looking out. It was too dark. We couldn't see anything. The only thing we could confirm was that scream was indeed very close to us. Camilla saw that the four of us were all present. She picked up the flashlight and gave us a signal with her eyes. Then she suddenly turned it on. The moment the light came on, we saw, about 10 meters in front of us, dozens of reindeer standing in a neat row. They were staring directly at our tent, without moving at all. The four of us were completely stunned. No one screamed, and we didn't dare to move at all. As I remembered what Camilla had once told me, that reindeer are just shy forest animals. One of the reindeer slightly opened its mouth and let out a sound. This is just unbelievable. The flashlight in Camilla's hand trembled. They must be sick. These reindeer are sick. Helen suppressed a scream. Then, they heard one of them begin to make a human-like cry for help. "I've had enough." Dawson suddenly shouted. He stood up, spread his arms wide, trying to make himself look bigger, more intimidating. We all know this is a good way to scare off wild animals, but the reindeer in front of him were not fooled. They began to lift their front legs, one by one. Lean back. Sit up straight. If I'm not mistaken, they're imitating humans. They're imitating Dawson's posture. Roger. Camilla, grab Dawson's arm. Don't provoke them. Let's go quickly. Helen was the first to heed Camilla's advice. She started to pack her luggage as quickly as possible. Dawson and I quickly joined her. Camilla stood outside the tent as a lookout, keeping a close watch on the deer herd's every move. The deer herd was silent for a long time. Then came another scream. But this time, it came from the west. When we looked toward that direction with our luggage, the empty west suddenly revealed more than a dozen pairs of eyes. The eyes of reindeer. Dawson handed Camilla her luggage, breathing heavily as he asked our guide, "What should we do? There are more and more of them, and they're everywhere." "Camilla, still trying to appear calm, said, "These might be Sami reindeer. They used to let their reindeer." She was interrupted by a sudden, sharp cry. The sound came from the nearest reindeer, so close Camilla could almost touch it. Then dozens, maybe hundreds of reindeer, charged madly towards our camp. They were like a pack of outlaws, crashing through the trees. Even stranger, when they attacked us, they didn't run on all fours, brandishing their antlers. Instead, they stood up like humans and lunged at us. Dawson was the first to start running. But he didn't run far. He was bitten on the arm by a reindeer, and fell to the ground. Then, 4 or 5 others charged at him. I can imagine that in less than a minute, he was trampled into a bloody mess. Camilla. It was the reindeer that had screamed first. It was pinned to the ground. You have to remember these behemoths. Each one weighs almost 300 pounds on average. I could faintly hear her cries. And the sound of her bones breaking. I protected my head and crawled upwards, burying myself in the mud without a care for how deep I went. This escape has been anything but easy. I can feel my ribs. My thighs have been brutally slammed. When I crawled onto a tree trunk, holding onto my life, I finally managed to escape the tidal wave of deer. At that point, it felt like the best luck amidst misfortune. Unfortunately, the pain and exhaustion hit me as soon as I let my guard down, and overwhelmed my whole body. Soon, I lost consciousness. When I opened my eyes again, the sun had risen as usual. The herd of deer had already vanished. I was still lying on the thick branch. At this moment, I was surprised to realize the tree I was on. It's the huge tree that suddenly appeared before. That enormous tree. Only now, there are no reindeer carcasses hanging from it. Only I, barely clinging to life. I used branches and rubber bands to make a makeshift splint to protect my aching leg. I disinfected all the scrapes and bruises on my body. I slowly climbed down the giant tree, but at this moment, I felt even more lost. I was confused. I was lost. And I was all alone. I had no communication devices left on me. I was in this Arctic swamp. Food and water were running low. I started moving forward unconsciously, crying as I walked. Of course, I didn't know where to go. I just couldn't help but take a step forward. When I calmed down and regained my composure, I remembered I could use the direction of the sun to find my way. By then, it was already afternoon. I sat down. I had some dry food to stave off hunger, preparing for the journey ahead. During this time, another question flashed through my mind. What about Helen? I remember she managed to escape last night too. If she's still alive, would she choose to head southwest? After all, the village is right there. And when she packed her luggage back then, she brought along a satellite locator. If I can meet up with her, everything will be much easier. I regained my confidence. I shakily stood up. Then I started using the sunlight to find my way southwest. This wetland is ridiculously vast. With my limping and stumbling, I've been moving for at least 2 days. 3 days, I can't really remember. Anyway, I can't see an end to it. Yes, I've slowly lost all sense of time. Because all around me is an endless, dead silence. At most, there's the occasional sound of a twig snapping. This silence, it reminds me of a local Swedish saying, called Tom Skog, which means, an open forest. When there are insects buzzing and birds singing in the forest, there's nothing to worry about. In fact, you'll feel relaxed and comfortable. But once the forest falls silent, that's when you should feel afraid. I am now trudging through Tomskog with great difficulty. The feeling is not just one of anxiety. It is more like a day that drags on endlessly. Finally, this dead silence is broken. That's right, it's still that scream. The sound is not far from me, but when I looked toward the source of the sound, I realized, this voice isn't the usual scream. It's Helen's voice. She screamed again. Twice, 3 times. My guess was right, but this sound is too painful. I wonder what kind of situation someone who screams like this is in. How much longer can I hold on? But I'm hampered by my leg and feet. My ribs are injured. Will I still be able to make it if I rush over there? I started to hesitate. My intuition told me she was directly north of me. I must save her. It's not just because she has a navigation device. More importantly, she is my colleague and friend. But my reason tells me I should continue to be cautious. Right now, we must take responsibility for ourselves first. I must head southwest without looking back. I must leave the wetlands. My internal struggle lasted until her cries for help stopped. I'm not sure if she fainted. All I know is, from that moment on, I panicked. I was afraid I would stand by and watch my friend die because I turned and walked away, and die a horrible death. So I still chose to rush towards the north. I rushed towards where I remembered her being. I discovered something that made me even more worried. I saw blood-stained low bushes. There were signs of a struggle here. I also found some dense deer tracks in the dry woodland. They all led northwest. Following the tracks, I began to hear intermittent screams, including Helen's. I was sure I was closer to her. And closer to those reindeer as well. I climbed up a hill. I nearly fell off a cliff. Standing at the edge, looking down, it was a completely dried up lake. There was a crack in the ground that seemed bottomless. Even though the afternoon sun is fierce, it still can't illuminate an inch of soil in the crack. And right at the edge of the crack, hundreds of reindeer are moving back and forth. Some walk on all fours. Others stand on two legs. They carry various pieces of meat, dead fish, and birds, throwing them one by one into the crack. Some didn't push toward the center. Instead they leaned against the edge, eating blue moss and flowers. I sat down on the ground, because I was scared. I saw Camila's clothes. Saw fragments of our tent. And some things with human clothing on them, torn and broken pieces of flesh. Helen. Helen's still alive. Her head is still moving. Her mouth is moving too, but she's extremely weak. She's being dragged into the abyss, bit, by the reindeer. The next second, a huge gray-white hand, it actually stretched out from the crack. The hand was unusually large. With just its fingers, it could completely cover Helen. It grabbed onto Helen. It pulled her toward the crack. It took a while for the reindeer herd to settle down. I couldn't help but hold my breath. One of them slowly lifted its front leg. It imitated a human posture, and turned toward the mountain peak. It then turned toward my direction. It saw me. Its mouth slightly opened. It uttered a sentence, "Come down. Help me." The voice was Helen's voice. Then, one by one, the reindeer stood up and looked at me. Gradually, they started mimicking these 4 words. "Come down and help me. Come down. Come down and help me." I anxiously started to hold my broken leg. I stood up, repeatedly cursing as I ran down the mountain. No one needs me to save them anymore. There were no supplies left to get. I told myself, I'm all alone. I need to escape. Don't look back. I ran south as hard as I could. Their sounds were right behind me, relentlessly pursuing. Sometimes close, sometimes distant. The sky grew darker bit by bit. My whole body was in excruciating pain, especially where my bones had already fractured. But I still dared not stop. I let the bushes scrape me again and again. I continued running, limping with every step. The sun had completely set. The sounds never stopped. My lungs were burning with intense heat. I really couldn't run anymore. I stopped. Just as I was catching my breath, leaning against a tree trunk, a pair of eyes appeared in the forest. A reindeer slowly walked out of the darkness. I smiled. I don't know why I laughed before dying. It feels like I realized that they could catch up with me at any moment. They're just creating fear. Creating despair. They're making me leave this world in endless despair. It's coming at me. It's raising its front legs, ready to strike. But suddenly, a gunshot exploded behind my head. The reindeer fell instantly. Its mouth was still twitching. It made Helen's sound. "Help me down. Help me." Then came the second shot. I was so scared, I shuddered. When I reacted, the reindeer showed no signs of life. Then, hundreds of deer hooves pounded the forest floor. They were frightened. They ran away. Slowly, I turned to look behind me. I was almost blinded by the sudden flashlight. 3 men walked out of the dense forest. They were speaking Swedish. They were all wearing jackets with the same logo. It was probably their company uniforms. That's my guess. I could only see it clearly when they got closer. The logo was 2 short-handled axes. The 2 people in front were speaking in Swedish, chattering at me for a while. I realized we couldn't communicate. The man behind them pushed them aside, squatted down, and said, "Hey, don't worry. You're American, right?" The man wasn't that old. It seems I can still see a bit of Inuit heritage. After realizing there was no language barrier, I swallowed and responded to the American. The American from Minnesota. He turned to look at his companions, and the two companions immediately left. He nodded his head. He spoke again, saying, "My name is Noah. I'm also American. Don't worry, you're safe now." Very soon, his two companions were dragging the dead reindeer back. They came back. He joined them immediately. The towering tree, I don't know when. And then they reappeared before us. They hung up the reindeer. Then, using the hatchet they carried, they carved a few marks on the tree. A circle with something in the middle. Problem solved. They took me back to their base camp. And gave me clean clothes, hot dogs, and beer. And warmed me by the fire. Helped me heal by the fire. I finally started to recover. The American named Noah sent the doctor away. He came closer again and asked if I was feeling better. "Tom." I nodded with the little strength I had left. "We've already notified the police. The embassy in Stockholm called. You can return to the US tomorrow." I looked at his face, and it seemed a bit familiar. I asked my question. "Thank you, Mr. Noah. Have we met before?" He smiled. "Turn your head and say yes. 2 hours ago. In the swamp." It wasn't me who interrupted his joke. "When I was lecturing in Anchorage on behalf of the university before. Weren't you there? In charge of the anthropology lectures and presentations?" His smile immediately disappeared. He answered me seriously and said, "If I were you, Tom, I wouldn't ask another word." I did as he said. I didn't say another word. The next day, I was indeed arranged to fly back to the US. Everything was as if it had never happened. Of course, Later, I talked to people from the Arctic Health Cooperative about this experience. Their response was nothing but regret. It was truly terrifying, and they suggested keeping it confidential, saying, not to hinder future research on the effects of climate change, but I doubt their motives. There were still deeper considerations. What truly brought me valuable information was an unexpected email. It was from Noah, the one who saved me. He told me they had been conducting various investigations, but unfortunately, no official institution was willing to disclose the results of their investigations. This experience and my research abilities are my wealth. If I am willing to help, they can provide more files for me to delve into. He did send me a document called 2013 West Virginia Greenbrier Valley. It recorded similar events. A lake dried up in the same way. A crack appeared in the same manner. Similarly, the valley below soon fell into chaos. Noah told me that it was only a matter of time before these experiences were made public. Whether or not the authorities deny it doesn't matter. My experience in the Arctic was the same. His experience in the Arctic was the same. I could clearly sense that he had gone through something similar. Like me, he had narrowly escaped death. Now, I'm under a different identity. I'm investigating more similar cases, and I can feel more clearly that similar things will happen in the future. Before I tell you my experience, I'd like to ask everyone in front of the screen, have any of you worked at a law firm? In 2017, I once interned at a law firm. For 3 months, I was assigned to a private biodiesel company within the state, as a junior legal assistant. The biggest impression that job left on me was how exhausting it was. I was constantly busy, endlessly busy, and the things I encountered there, you could say, it shocked me out of my dull, aimless work life, making me immediately wake up in fear, and quit the company without a second thought. At the beginning of February, the biodiesel company we outsourced to got a new boss. He had just taken office. A large number of proposals for expanding factory construction were put forward. In his plan, my hometown, Tomskog, was included. There is a forest area near that small town, waiting to be developed. I certainly remember that place. My parents told me from a young age that it was a private forest. Although it seemed to have been abandoned, only a few dilapidated houses are left, but they are not the legally designated forest rangers. They will still be prohibited from entering the area. I have remembered my elders' words for over 20 years. Now, finally, because of the asset assessment work, I am about to enter directly. So, that morning, I had just gotten off the highway and returned to Tomsk. I just drove straight into the woods and turned around. It was no different from what I had imagined. The trees were towering. There wasn't a single bird. I couldn't see any large animals. It had a quiet and desolate feel to it. The only difference was that it was much bigger than I had imagined. I'm not sure. This old map of unknown origin. Does it accurately depict the unfamiliar forest in front of me? The project team told me. This is even a survey map from 20 years ago. Fortunately, there are enough landmarks here to tell me what lies along the way, where I am headed. A straight line between the fence and the abandoned cabin. It's that simple. I drove through the early spring snow. I arrived at my destination by evening. The small, dilapidated cabin. Finally, I could get my butt off the driver's seat. I checked my phone and flashlight. Locked the car. The temperature in the woods is much colder than in the city. The snow is much thicker now. It's almost up to my knees. I gritted my teeth. Enduring the biting cold wind, I shouted, "Is anyone there?" The lonely echo told me that my question was in vain. Sour trade. Above the cabin, all the windows, sealed with wooden planks and nails, further confirmed that no one had lived here for a long time. But for work, I still went up and knocked on the door. Unfortunately, there was still no answer. The sky gradually grew darker. The shadows of the trees stretched longer under the sunset. I turned my head and sized up the house. I hesitated, wondering whether to turn back. But suddenly, a carved inscription above the door caught my attention. I didn't understand what it meant. How could it be that no one had lived here? Otherwise, who built it? Could it be that someone just built the house and left it here? I hesitated for a moment. I could feel a sense of threat. It felt like something was urging me to leave. Besides, it was getting late. But my hand accidentally touched the doorknob. The door wasn't locked at all. It creaked open. Okay, Casey. I told myself I'd just take a quick look, finish the report and leave. I walked into the house. The interior layout of the villa was very clear. There was a wooden bench in the hall, facing a simple fireplace, and 2 tables. Then there was no other furniture. On the westernmost wall were hung dried herbs, cowhide, and some inexplicable paintings. Each painting depicted the same thing: a dark, shadowy wood, and a woman in a wedding dress. Each woman looked different, it seemed. No, wait, these aren't paintings. I wiped the dust off the photo frame. This is the photo. Maybe this is the owner of the house who inherited it through generations. As long as I find her, everything will be easy. I thought to myself, just keep going deeper into the house. An idea kept lingering in my mind. As long as I find any object that records a name, I might be able to figure out who this bride dressed up as. Unfortunately, in the end, I didn't find anything. The flashlight started flickering. Eventually, it failed. Maybe you should try lighting a fire. I had an idea. I pulled out the lighter from my pocket. Although I quit smoking 2 years ago, I still carried one. I picked up a piece of kindling, lit it, and then ignited all the firewood in the fireplace. Whoever you are, bride, you should thank me. The house you live in has brought a bit of life back to it. I muttered. I opened the front door for ventilation. After all, carbon monoxide poisoning is no joke. But when I turned back from the door, the scene by the fireplace made my heart feel calm. I thought of my father. He and I used to love going to the lake to fish and hunt. Then we would spend the night in our cabin. He liked to warm his hands by the fire. I would snuggle in his arms. The stove was a place filled with memories of our father-daughter bond. In 2010, he left me forever. The truth told me, lighting this fire was the right thing to do. The firelight illuminated a corner of the hall, making it instantly clear that a wall tile had been replaced with a piece of sheet metal. It is an old house after all, and I effortlessly pried that section open with my bare hands. I found a metal box. The box wasn't sealed. Inside, there are 4 things lying quietly: a broken pocket watch, an empty bottle of liquor, 3 empty shotgun shells, and a notebook. The notebook caught my eye. I quickly picked it up and brought it to the fireplace. The sky had completely darkened. I can only read the first page by the light of the fire. There are only 2 words on it that make no sense. Written by, who wrote this? Who wrote it? Come on, say something. I helplessly shake my head. I continue turning the pages. I used to have a name. I also had an identity, but that was only in the past. Now, they have all been buried. My thoughts have become pale and empty. My heart is full of anger. but I can't remember what I was angry about. I laughed and said, "Hey, I'm pretty angry too, you jerk. How do I write this? It's inexpressible." Just muttering to myself. Then I continued reading. This house isn't mine. As I recall, no one has ever lived here. The rest of the content. It was a series of memories, about the trivialities of his life. He had grown up in Wisconsin. He was the child of a shoemaker. His first love was so-and-so. His first kiss was with a certain girl. His first job was what? But the closer it got to the day he started writing his diary, the memories became increasingly blurry. Yes, starting from a certain point, he felt something was wrong with him. In his words, something came to be beside him. He started to forget things, and he started to feel inexplicably afraid. He prepared his weapons. He locked the doors and windows. He locked himself inside to protect himself. Maybe I really shouldn't have taken over from their family. Here, he wrote. He doesn't want me to stay here. But I can't say a word to him. I can't. The rest of the content is even more confusing. He seems to be struggling with something. But he can't describe what it is. The records have become more and more fragmented. There's no cause or effect. In the end, he broke the pocket watch. He said he had completely given up on the concept of time. For him, it no longer mattered. Because sometimes he spends an entire afternoon, and it feels like only 10 minutes have passed. His perception doesn't match at all with the clock's recording. It's driving him crazy. Can I recover? He wrote, or maybe my pocket watch is malfunctioning. Can it be fixed? I was startled. I looked up. The fire in the fireplace was almost out. But the sound wasn't coming from there. It was coming from my phone. It was my bedtime alarm I'd set. I'd actually been reading this little diary. For 6 hours. That's completely illogical. I muttered to myself as I looked through the front door, toward the woods in the night. It was indeed already midnight. I tightly gripped the diary and stood up. I looked around the empty log cabin, and it was deserted. But I felt an overwhelming sense of fear I couldn't shake off. I had a feeling. A feeling that I had experienced some kind of terrifying event. But I can't explain why. I looked down at the notebook. Suddenly, I realized that this feeling was exactly as the author described. There was also a very strong sense of unease. It was as if someone was staring at me from somewhere. I added some wood to the fireplace. Continue reading. He documented some strange experiences. His wine bottle was suddenly empty, but he remembered never having drunk any. His herbs suddenly covered the walls, almost obscuring the original owner's photograph. But in his memory, he had never put away the herbs he'd been drying. He started testing. He hid something in the house. Undoubtedly, no one would be able to find it. So he came up with a plan. He replaced the bricks with metal plates. This way, even if he didn't remember what was inside, he would still pry open the wall out of curiosity, and find what he had hidden. Luckily, with this trick, I can always find my gun and bullets. He wrote. In this forest, besides him, there are some strange intruders. They seem to be a group of strange kids. I don't know where they came from. But after eating my shotgun pellets, they don't dare come back anymore. Those I killed. I've listed them next to the barn. I need to write it down. Why do I suddenly feel like crying? The diary is nearing its end. He began to feel unusually sad. He was very depressed, but he himself didn't know why. He said his crying was like muscle memory. It was like something inside his body was reminding him, you should be sad. I'll still carve it on the door. He wrote that no one had ever lived here. I don't remember this place. Nor do I remember anyone living here. This is a warning. A warning to myself and all those who come. And his final handwriting was a series of characters that sent chills down my spine. I remember now. It started when I lit the fire. When I ignited the fireplace. I quickly turned and looked at the fireplace. Everything seemed normal there. But it made my hair stand on end. I think I might be following in that person's footsteps. Snow began to fall outside. Everything was so peaceful, both inside and outside. But a strong feeling overwhelmed me. Something is here. And it has already affected me. I know the heat you're talking about. I should review my memories, question myself repeatedly. Who am I? What is my job? Why did I come here? I remember. I remember everything, but I still feel like there are gaps in my memory. And I feel extremely tense. Like something's about to happen. Like the quietest part of a horror movie. Quiet is meant to be broken. I know, but what will break it? My mind is racing, and I haven't stopped moving. I came to the old barn. Involuntarily, I hid in the ruins behind the collapsed wall. Because I could clearly feel that. If I had stayed in that villa for even a second longer, I would have been consumed a little more by something, a little more. I tried desperately to unlock my phone, to call for help. But I can't open it. It seems that my hand is frozen. I can't click the unlock pattern. While I was fiddling with my phone, I vaguely remembered that he had passed by me before. Because I didn't make a sound, he silently ignored me. However, he was still looking for me. Could it be that he doesn't have eyes? Is he using sound to find me? Did that man leave behind any weapons? The thought suddenly crossed my mind. With the light from my phone screen, I opened the diary again. During this time, he kept making noises. I'm sure he made a sound. I just don't remember it. It could have been the sound of bricks from the barn, or maybe the creaking of wood. It also sounded like iron hinges. The sound of them being removed from the barn's back door. Never mind all that, because I finally found the diary entry I was looking for. He felt terrible after writing about how he shot the intruder, for reasons he couldn't explain. He was overcome with grief. Then he left a note. I threw the damn thing into the haystack. But I can't find it now. Because I don't remember what it looks like. I must have turned over that weapon. But I don't remember what it looks like. I don't remember. How can I get it back? Suddenly, there's an extra set of footsteps in my memory. Footsteps leaving. Does this mean he left the ruins? And went back upstairs to the cabin? I seized the opportunity, and dove into the haystack. I immediately found an old double-barrel shotgun. It even still had some bullets loaded. When was the last time I fired a gun? It was when I went hunting with my father in 2003. Of course, I remember it well. It's one of those memories that has stuck with me. It's etched in my mind. I really don't know how to use this thing anymore. But I had no choice. Otherwise, I'd be a lamb to the slaughter. That's right, I'm fighting back. I hurried around, heading for where I'd parked my car. But another set of hurried footsteps stopped me. He was waiting for me at the barn door. I know. Or rather, I remember seeing him there. I raised my gun. I aimed around. I paced back and forth. Then I would stop at times. We circled each other like this. But he had me completely under control. In the barn. I couldn't find a way out. Did you digest it? I suddenly heard this sentence. It was my voice. It was me speaking. I said that to it. It seems I just started a conversation with it. But I don't remember when it started. So you slowly consume my memories. Is that so? I asked again. I'm a little confused. How am I communicating? Can this thing still talk? The next second, I quickly chambered the shotgun. If you just think it's fun, then you'll have to taste the real thing in my hand. Time seemed to pause for a few seconds. Or perhaps a few seconds of my memory were swallowed again. We stopped circling. I gripped my weapon tighter. Step by step, I approached the barn door. If this thing in front of me eats our memories as food, replenishing my energy, and if he can remember that memory for us, if he has a brain, then that brain is a file of thoughts. At least, that's my reasoning. I walked back into the snow. I saw the ground was full of messy footprints. Heaven knows how many times I've walked here. Back and forth. But now I only have one direction to move forward. I can't take any more risks with my car. I have to leave. I don't know why. The owner of the journal didn't leave. I just know I'm different from him. I must escape right now. It felt as if something in my body had injected some kind of toxin into me. This toxin made me sometimes drift into a trance, and at other times, I regained my sanity. That's why my path was winding and erratic. I would suddenly run toward the small cabin, then turn around and run toward the barn. In the chaos, I saw an image. It was of me as a child, holding my father's hand, and carrying fishing gear along the muddy lakeside. I can feel the image slowly fading away, slipping out of my life. I desperately try to hold on to this memory, frantically recalling it. Memories of gathering bait. Memories of learning to tie knots. Memories of learning to read the floats. I instinctively tried to remember it. I knew that once I forgot, it would all be over. I finally got back in the car. I felt like I had been completely consumed by the toxin. I curled up in the back seat, hugging the shotgun, crying quietly. I started to shake my head back and forth. Maybe I was trying to wake myself up. I completely forgot what I had done. I even forgot what I was doing. The door of my car was turned. I suddenly realized and tried to lock it, but I found the 4 doors were already locked. And I was no longer in the back seat. Instead, I was in the driver's seat. The key was already in the ignition. Unchanged was the shotgun still in my arms. I didn't dare loosen my grip for a moment. I seem to remember it climbing around my car, trying to break in. What does it look like? I think I've seen it before, but I really can't remember. It's definitely a physically existing thing. It has teeth, skin, and claws. I feel like my head is splitting. My body aches terribly. I think I'm bleeding. The sunlight is on me. I can see my clothes are covered in blood. What? Sunlight? Is it daylight already? I'm lying in the grass. The car in front of me crashed into the protective netting at the edge of the woods. The car door was wide open. That feeling of being consumed was gone. Completely gone. But I still instinctively checked the shotgun. It was empty. I had already fired all the rounds. Do you ask if I remember what happened afterward? Of course I remember. My car wasn't severely damaged. I drove it back home. My mother hurriedly took me to the hospital. She didn't call the police. She just kept repeating, "Why did you take that risk to go to that place? This job isn't right for you." She was right. I shouldn't have gone to that forest. I will never dare to go again. However, I successfully brought out that cursed diary. I handed it over to my superior. Surprisingly, in addition to the company's compensation, the manager immediately arranged a meeting. To be precise, it was the investors who requested it. They expressed their deep gratitude to me for helping them find what they truly wanted. The answer to the disappearance of a group of employees from years ago. What is puzzling is that the investors want to continue developing this forest land. I don't understand. In their eyes, does making money really matter more than human lives? Our new boss, of course, refused the request. I also left the company after I fully recovered. Left the firm. Left the office. People who have experienced serious illness will have sequelae. People who have experienced war will also have sequelae. It seems I did too. I can't exactly describe what I went through. It's just that I really have lost some memories. I left them in that wooden villa. So I posted it online, before I forget even more. Now, I can't even remember the color of my father's eyes. I hope it's just because he's been gone for too long. I hope so. My mother once told me a story. When I was a child, she loved to lift me up to the telescope and let me gaze at the stars. Because of some unexpected events, on the night I was born, she couldn't make it to the hospital in time. Instead, she gave birth in an open area. So, she always felt that I had an unexplainable connection with the starry sky. Through the telescope, she showed me constellations like the Big Dipper, Virgo, and Orion. Of course, there was also the moon. Then, one time, she pointed the telescope at a specific direction. It was Jupiter. Then I started screaming like a mad person. The atmosphere between mother and son went from warm and harmonious to one of panic and confusion. Until I grew up. She never figured out why. She just told me, "Do you know? At that time, you looked like you had seen some kind of monster." After I comforted you, I also looked through the telescope. I didn't see anything at all. I don't know either. What exactly did you see that night? But this mystery has terrified me for over 20 years. My dad, however, was rather unconcerned about it. He always jokingly said it was because of that telescope that I studied geology, and ended up working in a geography-related field. After all, I don't dare look up. Then I'll just look down. Okay, he does have a point. I do have some talent in geology. After earning my degree in geology from Michigan State University, I went to Norway to pursue my master's. In the end, at a related institution in Reston, Virginia, I found an internship. By 2013, not only was I financially independent from this job, my peers also began to refer to me as a young geologist. It was also in March of that year. Yes, I remember it very clearly. March of 2013. My life was once again shaken by an impact that would change it forever. I had just turned 24. I had a deep connection with a girl named Lynn Galro. Although we had only gone on 2 proper dates, we could both genuinely feel the affection between us. She was like me. She also enjoys outdoor activities. Every time we go out for fun, we go hiking. So, the 3rd date was no exception. And she told me that she had prepared a surprise this time. I remember it was a night far from town. The 7 of us had already hiked out into the suburbs. It was getting too late. We can only set up camp temporarily. Lynn didn't tell me that we wouldn't be able to return tonight, so I didn't bring our camping tent. Maybe we'll have to share one with her. We'll spend the night together. Of course, this isn't the surprise she gave me. The real gift she hid was a stargazing party on the mountaintop. She and her friends had prepared tents, blankets, and folding chairs, and all sorts of drinks and snacks. They even set up a telescope. They said the news the previous day reported that a meteor shower would be passing through, so they planned this party under the stars. I have to say, the stars away from the city, it was exceptionally clean and beautiful. We took turns observing the night sky with telescopes. When it was my turn, I realized I hadn't really seen so many stars in the sky for a very, very long time. The stars in my eyes were no longer a static image, but truly existing, twinkling planets. A shooting star streaked across the sky, even more breathtaking. My attention followed that shooting star until it passed in front of Jupiter. I seemed to suddenly feel my heart skip a beat. How can I say this? It felt like my soul had been adrift. A memory from 22 years ago. Time rushed into my mind, followed by a series of buzzing sounds in my ears. At first, I thought the telescope was malfunctioning, but when I tried to lift my head, the sound was still vibrating repeatedly. Then I realized I couldn't shift my attention away from it. It felt like there was a force in my subconscious, pressing me in front of the telescope, forcing me to look at that enormous giant planet in the solar system. My neck started to twitch, but I couldn't make a sound, and my eyes couldn't close either. I couldn't blink, unable to control. The roaring sound grew louder and louder. Gradually, it seemed to transform into rhythmic speech. Accompanying this was the appearance of several red spots within the rotating storm on Jupiter's surface. Some were enormous, others were extremely tiny. The next moment, I seemed to understand everything I was hearing and seeing. Those spots were eyes staring at me, and the roaring sound had formed a sentence that appeared in my mind. In the eyes of my other friends, I probably looked like I was having a seizure. Lynn and later described my condition at the time. They said that I just took a glance through the telescope and started trembling, foaming at the mouth. When I collapsed and started convulsing, I apparently repeated the same phrase over and over with 3 different tones. When I regained consciousness, I was already lying in the camp. In front of me was someone holding a first aid kit, with the friends on the satellite emergency phone. At that time, they were still having an intense discussion, whether to make the call for help, or urgently bring me down the mountain. "Oh, I'm fine now." My sudden words interrupted all their discussion, but I truly have no idea what happened just now. They started having an intense discussion again. Some said I was having an epileptic fit. They said his cousin has the same condition. He knew. Others said I hadn't eaten enough and was suffering from low blood sugar. Later on, some even started to speculate that I might have liver problems. In the end, the stargazing party night turned into a night of unease. Wrapped things up hastily. And because of this farce, I didn't continue with their itinerary the next day. Instead, I turned and went home, even though Lynn and repeatedly reminded me to stay in touch with her after I got home. I still chose to go home and get a good sleep first. But clearly, this trick didn't work. I woke up. My hands and feet were still trembling. My eyes felt hot. My jaw ached constantly. Even stranger was, I had just woken up after sleeping for 14 hours. I was stunned at that moment. I stared blankly at the ceiling. He uttered a sentence. I tried to attribute all these problems to high pressure and fatigue. After all, the day before, I went hiking and climbing mountains, and drank quite a bit. However, instinct drove me to look up astronomical data. My intuition convinced me that it was definitely related to that huge planet. 15251550, this is a field I need to relearn. It's truly an area that requires relearning. I searched for information on the storms and dust on this gas giant. I found various data on the composition of its gases. I learned about Jupiter's rings, and the basic knowledge of Jupiter's moons, etc. But this isn't what I wanted to know. I think I saw something much deeper. It was like a frozen lake. That night, my gaze pierced the ice. I saw some mysterious substance in the depths of the lake. My search for answers was fruitless. I had no choice but to ignore the incident. But it was as if something in my life had been unlocked. From that day on, whenever I hear low-frequency vibrations, I suddenly zone out, stopping in my tracks, gazing blankly at the source of the sound. For example, the refrigerator at night, or the vibration of a phone. It's like having a psychic connection. Although I haven't told Lynn, but she still sensed remotely that I was unwell. She urged me to see a doctor more than once. I naturally didn't want my sweetheart to worry about me for no reason, so I listened to her. But the doctor couldn't find any potential problems. At least, not physiologically. But my actual feelings told me otherwise. The low-frequency sounds in daily life began to affect me more and more. I started hearing pitches in the chaotic vibrations. I could make out phrases. I could hear the general content of the sentences. It was like saying, I don't understand the language, but I understood its meaning. It was something like, I see you. I've never learned any other language. But I just knew what it meant. Knew it from the bottom of my heart. And that sentence was slowly pushing me to the brink of a mental breakdown. One evening, I was cooking chicken breasts in the kitchen, juggling that with replying to Lynn's message. But the hum of the kitchen air conditioner suddenly turned into a strange roar. Old Estier. That sound repeated over and over. I don't know how long I stood there, stunned, until I realized I was coughing incessantly, because of the burnt chicken, and I snapped back to reality. I didn't tell Lynn. I just quickly made a bowl of tomato soup, instead of dinner. Even so, when I stirred the soup with a spoon, in my eyes, I seemed to see the great red spot on Jupiter again. It kept spinning and accelerating. It turned into a giant eye staring at me. I screamed and threw the whole bowl out. The red soup splashed onto my wall, but what I saw next was more eyes. Eyes of all sizes, all staring at me. My fear of space reached its peak in that moment. I fell to the ground, trembling and rolling, instinctively begging for mercy. I endured a half hour I don't want to remember. Only then did I finally crawl up from the cold ground. I didn't dare look at my kitchen again. I just picked up my phone and went back to the bedroom. I called Lynn N for help. An hour later, she rushed over from another district. Frantically, she drove me to the hospital. Perhaps it was the mental torment that drove me to the extreme. I filled out some forms at the hospital. I underwent some tests. I've forgotten all of it. Or maybe I did it on purpose. I deliberately ignored everything around me. I just wanted to relax. I was afraid of seeing something again. It would remind me again of that terrifying planet that wanted to steal my soul. In my memory, it feels like I was in a trance, experiencing repeated convulsions more than once. The people around me kept changing, but there was one person who seemed to have stayed with me. Since the night after the second day, her figure was so familiar. But it wasn't until I truly started to improve that I realized it was my mother. After Lynn and called her, she rushed over from our hometown, day and night. She stayed with me through that painful week. She took care of me until I woke up. Do you remember? You used to like sleeping with the window open. Although she said that, it may be because she saw it was late at night outside, and the stars had climbed into the night sky, so she closed the window. I sat up straight and replied, I don't really remember. Not turning on the lights, not hugging a stuffed animal. You only need to look at the sky outside the window, and you can fall asleep without being comforted. Don't you remember? I still have a bit of a headache. I didn't answer her. Then she walked over and grabbed my arm, saying, actually, the night you were born, your father and I never thought you'd survive. She said everything went haywire that night. The car broke down again. Your father took a wrong turn again. He thought we could still cross a field and walk to the hospital. I replied, I know. I was born in the fields. Fortunately, the medical staff found us. She continued speaking. If it hadn't been for the clear sky that night and the bright starlight, they would have never found us. It was the stars that saved your life. She squeezed my hand. I slowly looked out of the window. At that unclear vast darkness. It actually gave me a strange sense of comfort at this moment, replacing the mental breakdown and madness that had appeared again. My mother continued to speak softly beside me. We really thought you were going to be gone, but as soon as we heard their voices, we knew you would definitely be alright. Suddenly, I felt like I had returned to that field where I was born. Returned to the starry sky of my birth. A voice, from some impossibly distant and ancient time, surfaced in my mind. I was discharged the next morning. The doctor said my recovery was surprisingly quick. They gave me some prescription medicine for my neuralgia. Then I was discharged. Lynn had parked at the hospital entrance before dawn, waiting to take me home, but when I got into the passenger seat, I suddenly felt a chill run down my spine again. What's wrong? She asked me, are you okay? Should I? Wait. I said that, looking around. I think I saw a light. It flashed across the pre-dawn sky, which wasn't fully bright yet. It was fleeting. I instinctively pointed in a direction. Can Lin Ning send me over there? Just that area, she asked, somewhat puzzled. Over there? But that requires going on the highway. Yes, no problem. Let's go. Even with her doubts, she still turned the car around. Zero. Where are we going? Let's just follow the road. Just go in that direction. And I think this is my truest feeling. Because I really don't know the meaning of this decision. I don't know what's at the destination either. This thought just suddenly popped into my mind. What was supposed to be the day I was discharged and went home, turned into an unexpected road trip. The two of us happily crossed the state line and headed toward West Virginia. Lynn went from being confused to excited, treating it as an impromptu adventure. Even if it meant stopping along the way to eat and drink, I can still feel we're getting closer and closer to that thing that was once so far away. And like that, we drove on and off from dawn till nightfall, and stopped by a gravel road with a signpost. We stopped the car and walked onto the path. We ventured deeper into the valley. Lin N played a little tune by John Danforth on her Walkman. She hummed along while climbing. Then, excitedly, she asked me if we could consider today our fourth date. I felt a little embarrassed and said, sorry, Lynn. You've had dates with others before. It's definitely much better than this. She shook her head and said I was thinking too much. Only when it's much worse, can you rest assured. When the road beneath our feet changed from gravel to dirt, I could feel that we were already very close to it. To be honest, I'm not sure what we are getting closer to. It seemed like a place full of emptiness. But my subconscious told me that if I could reach there, all my ailments and suffering would disappear. We picked up the flashlight and entered the wild forest. Lynn's ever-present compass and satellite phone, along with other outdoor gear, it gave us plenty of courage and confidence. After walking a mountain path for over 2 hours, finally, a bright light appeared before us. It was midnight by then. We reached a mountaintop overlooking the lake. What met our eyes were houses on the high ground by the lake, the lights of fishing boats, and a sky full of stars. Everything around us was so peaceful and comfortable. Lynn and I exchanged a glance. We smiled. This is the place, I told her. After glancing at the satellite map, she asked me, we're in Greenbrier County now. Is this a special place for you? I could only honestly answer that I had never been here before. She probably found my absurd answer amusing. She laughed and said, "All right." Then she began to join me in rummaging through the water and the little snacks left in my backpack. We began to enjoy the beautiful scenery before us. We chatted about everything. We watched the fishing boats on the lake. But just like that camping trip a few days ago, the beautiful night was suddenly shattered by that streak of red. That's right, those red eyes on the surface of Jupiter. In an instant, I could feel they were watching me. Once again, a rumbling vibration surrounded me. "Are you okay?" Lynn patted my head. I briefly snapped back to reality. I told myself, I just had an episode, a little medicine, and it will be fine. It's nothing. But when I looked into her eyes, I saw a red light flickering in them. Something's wrong. This isn't a hallucination. It was the reflection of the sky's anomaly. Because Lynn's smile suddenly disappeared as well, she also turned to look at the night sky. We all saw it. At that moment, in the sky, there appeared a very bright red star-like point. It seemed to be at the center of some massive vortex. Initially, Lynn's first reaction was to take out her camera, take a photo of this special scenery, but my sudden collapse caused her to fluster and rush to catch me. In her eyes, I had fallen ill again, but in my experience, everything around me became clearer than ever before. I could feel the pressure of her hand on my chest. I could hear her screaming at the top of her lungs. I could hear from the lake in the distance. It seemed many residents were frantically calling for help. And the clearest sound was that voice from the faraway sky. It was still dark before my eyes, but I could hear Lynn crying as she opened her backpack. Taking out the satellite phone to call for help, she put it on speakerphone. But that phone, which I'd used for 4 or 5 years, a phone that had always been reliable, suddenly and inexplicably, just kept making noise. I felt like I was being pulled away, pulled towards the sky. Lynn was trying to hold on to me, but compared to the force that is trying to take control of my body, it is insignificant. The force dragging me grew stronger and stronger. Lynn also switched to using a rope to tie my ankle, desperately pulling me back into the woods. It was useless. Everything she did was in vain. I could only drown in despair and sadness, getting farther and farther from the one I loved. Suddenly, my eyes snapped open. Just at that moment, the red vortex in the sky emitted a light that illuminated the entire night. It burned through my retina. I believe that my consciousness suddenly returning was no coincidence, because it was just after that half second, the entire Grimblair region was shaken by terrifying tremors. Lynn rushed up and grabbed me, but our gaze was immediately drawn to the valley below. The peaceful lake, once calm with boats passing by, was now surging violently. A massive crack had appeared in the center of the lake. Fishing boats, fish, and trees were being swallowed up as if by some force, dragged into that bottomless chasm. In less than 5 minutes, the entire lake completely dried up. Only a few fishermen, and those who had taken shelter in houses on higher ground, managed to survive. The earthquake stopped, leaving only the groans of the lakeside animals, the creaking of broken boats in the lake, and the agonized, desperate wails of the survivors along the shore, echoed throughout the entire Greenbrier Valley. Oh, and until the very end, that huge red vortex in the sky still watched over everything in the mountains. The two of us who survived, Lynn and I frantically dialed numbers, calling every agency we could think of. I even called my own boss. My boss at the Geological Survey. That was all I could do. Those hundreds of lives, lost in an instant. There was nothing we could do. So, you want to know what happened next? After I was discharged from the hospital, I'm back in the hospital again. My ribs were fractured when that mysterious force dragged me towards the sky. It was an accident. Besides that, there's nothing too serious. When I'm better, I'll return to work at the bureau. They actually already hastily resolved and filed this matter. Even stranger is, I'm not allowed to conduct any further investigation into this so-called sudden earthquake. Even looking at local news in Greenbrier only shows a cursory report of the losses. There must be some secret hidden here. A secret that outsiders are not allowed to know, and I believe that those so-called files or the TV news, were extremely misleading from the very beginning. This is not a geological event at all. I know for sure that this is a threat from outer space. Today marks 11 years since then. Lynn, who has already become my wife, has long since put all of this behind her. What she doesn't know is, although I haven't had another episode these years, I still sometimes hear that whisper. I hope more people will know the truth. I hope that more people can join me in putting an end to this once and for all. Lynn and I are about to have our second daughter. I hope my wife and child are safe. Don't be afraid of being under the night sky anymore. Noah, that's all I know. You said that when that child returns from the North Pole, you'll transcribe what I said into a document and send it to him, right? You promised me. You must do it. When the camellias fall, it's not the petals that wither one by one, but the whole flower that falls to the ground. It looks just like a human head falling to the ground. That's why I always feel that although camellias are beautiful, they naturally carry a sinister aura. It was when the camellias were on the verge of falling that I braved the cold wind and arrived at the Jinguji family. The master of the house is a charming writer. Noriharu Shinguji, along with his son, have long lived on this quiet hillside. If it weren't for applying for the maid position, I might never have opened any of Mr. Noriharu's novels. To learn about my employer's situation, his book's prefaces mention it several times. Many of his dark and painful inspirations come from this mountain wilderness. I guess it's somehow connected to the camellias in the garden. Miss Yamada, how about you start for a month? He suddenly put down the contract and said, pulling my thoughts back indoors. Oh no, how about 1 week instead? Let's see how it goes first. I quickly agreed. He added, if you don't like it, you can quit at any time. No problem. You can work here for a few days first. Let's see if I can adapt, so I don't push myself too hard. Yes, sir. I accepted again. Thinking of the old maid who used to work here, who worked here until she was old and retired. There shouldn't be any unpleasant surprises. That would make me quit halfway. Why did he say that? Does he think we young people can't endure hardship? Right, and he added, come with me. There's something I must tell you beforehand. Mr. Jianming took me on a tour of the house, without saying another word, until we returned to the center of the residential area of the mansion. He let out a big sigh. He said, Miss Yamada, this building is a bit special. You shouldn't be scared. I'm a bit confused by being scared. Actually, his words did catch me off guard for a moment. He nodded. Have you ever thought about it? Where do people go after they die? This topic changed too quickly. I didn't even react right away. I could only try my best to keep up with the thoughts of this middle-aged gentleman. I said, I don't know. Sorry, sir. He didn't answer me immediately. Instead, he looked around before speaking. I was born and raised here. There has always been something that's been a burden on my mind. I'll just say it directly. Our family's farmland is like a passageway. Of course, it's not a route that everyone from Japan takes. Not everyone passes through here, but for those who have died in this small town, this is indeed the only passage. I'm not sure what to say anymore. It's like I finally understood what he meant. Are you still planning to sign it? Are you still planning to go through with it? I mimicked his actions from just now. I looked around at my surroundings. Of course, I'm not some supernatural enthusiast. And I'm not very brave either. It's just that the salary offered by Mr. Jinguji is really too tempting. Even if what he says is true. What is this? A passage where spirits pass through? How scary can it be to stay a poor soul? I gritted my teeth, and gave him a definite answer. When I moved in, I realized that the Jingong Temple's estate is really huge. It's like the area of a residential complex where just the father and son live. The size of the whole neighborhood, a 1-week trial period, was hardly enough for me to fully understand the work in every corner. Fortunately, their equipment is very modern. Whether it's the kitchen work, or tending to the garden, everything is done quite efficiently. What's even luckier is that Mr. Jianming and his only son, Xiamu, are both very, very kind, and have given me a lot of leeway. Day by day, I continue working. Although I am busy every day, I am gradually gaining confidence. But the first time I met Natsum, it really took me by surprise. He is very handsome. And also very gentle. He has the same graceful demeanor as his father. I just realized I was standing in the kitchen when, some unusual surprise. He told me, "Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to ignore you. I thought I saw a ghost again." I didn't know what to say. It was just instinct. I replied, "Sorry." He moved closer. He asked me if my father had told me everything about the family. The matters of this family. I still only used a few words to give him a confirming reply. I didn't even dare to look him in the eye. He is about the same age as me. Before coming here, I never thought about it. Mr. Jianming has such a refined and charming son. You live here. One day you'll meet them. But when that happens, don't panic. And don't scream. Just pretend you didn't see them. Pretend they don't exist. Is that okay? Why is that? Because they all travel to that world alone. If they find someone who can see them, it's like a child discovering a friend who understands and can accompany them. They'll cling to you. You probably wouldn't want that, right? I find Natsam's words a little confusing, because this is completely different from the portrayal of the undead in the horror novels and films I've seen. In a way, they are actually more pitiable than terrifying, aren't they? Come to think of it, they're actually more pitiful than we are. Rather than being mostly frightening, wouldn't you agree? But I quickly forgot all these thoughts. I still didn't see any ghosts. I just silently stayed in this tranquil countryside. I was doing my job. Until that morning of the 7th day, I still got up early. I ran from the north building where I lived to the south wooden building, to clean the rooms. As I climbed the stairs, wiping them step by step, a baby's cry suddenly rang out in my ears. My first instinct was to look up, but I saw nothing. Then I heard the second sound. I followed the sound and walked toward the third storage room in the hallway, but I couldn't see anything or anyone that could have made that noise. At that time, I naively thought it was a stray cat that had entered the room, but when I discovered, it seemed like the abandoned curtain underfoot. Something was moving in the undulations. I suddenly noticed that beneath it, there was a human-shaped object about the size of a palm, tugging at the fabric of its clothes, producing a series of cries. I immediately remembered what the Shinmonji father and son had said. I was so scared that I didn't even grab the cloth and rushed downstairs. I reported the incident during lunch that same day, yet they all looked so nonchalant about it. It was probably the baby who passed away somewhere in the town. Mr. Jianming said it might be because the heavens were cruel. Really? That's so pitiful. He put down his chopsticks. He looked at me with a very serious expression and said, "Don't overthink it. This is a survival skill for living here, understand?" His tone wasn't cold. It was more like indifference and a hint of sincerity. That afternoon, dark clouds gathered, and a strong wind blew. I was busy collecting the laundry. What a coincidence, Yamada. It was the very last day. You saw the so-called spirits. But in my heart, it felt like an intense struggle was taking place. I kept asking myself, what now? Do you still plan to go on? Can you still handle this? Just as I let go of the sheet, I suddenly saw Natsum through the camellias in front of me. He was sitting in the courtyard's long corridor, playing with my cards. And beside me, there was a seemingly 90-something-year-old stranger, looking down at me. They all saw me, and smiled at me. Strangely, I didn't feel scared at that moment. Instead, I felt an indescribable emotion. It began to churn in my heart. I brought my clothes and sheets back inside. I went to find Mr. Jinming. I signed the contract renewal for the long-term job. Alright, I have to admit, more than saying that one can actually live harmoniously with the spirits of the dead. The main reason was that I've developed a bit of affection for them. Now, when I do housework, I repeatedly sneak peeks at them. Mr. Jianming is a very refined gentleman. His wife passed away a long time ago, but he hasn't remarried. Does that mean there's a chance for me? Or perhaps Natsum isn't dating anyone right now. Does that mean I have a chance too? I started to fantasize. What if one day, one of them shows interest in me, or confesses to me? What should I do? No, I can't think about this anymore. Because at least for now, every day, I am still in the house. I saw at least 2 different kinds of undead. How could I still have the mind for those fleeting romances? It's like when I just brought tea to the 2 of them. I suddenly saw in the corner, an old woman, completely naked. My hand, holding the tray, shook uncontrollably. It was probably out of fear. It was probably more of a shock. But I still tried my best to stop myself from screaming. Natsum probably noticed something was wrong with me. He immediately got up and took the tray for me. Actually, he understood everything. In fact, he did that to block my view of the old woman. "Thank you for the tea, Kasue. Go and rest." He called me by my name. I suppressed my excitement. I left the study, but I saw Mr. Jianming hurrying towards the drawing room. After a while, Natsum reappeared before me, holding an empty teacup. He reappeared before me again, holding an empty teacup. Father must have gone to report it to the police just now. He seems to know that old woman. She's a grandmother living alone at the foot of the mountain. It looks like she was taking a bath. As expected, news spread through the town shortly after. It is said that the old woman passed away while taking a bath. She fell ill and died during that time. The water in her house just kept running like that. The light stayed on as well. She lay in the bathroom for over a whole day. No one noticed this until Mr. Jianming called the police. I heard that some people aren't discovered until a long time after they've died. This is what they call dying in loneliness. Recently, the rain has been getting heavier. The camellias are starting to droop. I've also been at the Jinguji temple for about a month now. We've started to get closer. Not just with the Jinguji father and son, but with the people in the town as well. When they heard that I worked at the Jinguji shrine, they would all compete to send me gifts. They said their families had been taking care of the local residents for generations. Perhaps that's why there are always elderly people praying at the gate of the village. Over time, I became friends with the fishmonger, Murata. The coffee shop employee, Sakamoto, became familiar with me, but what caught my attention more was a regular customer who also frequently visited the cafe. I found out his name was Shinichiro Takabayashi. He was around 30 years old. He was said to be a web designer. He always had a melancholic aura about him. He would bring his laptop and sit in a corner of the cafe to work. Sakamoto told me that he's also been single for many years. Hey, does this mean I have a chance too? After much effort, I finally found an opportunity to strike up a conversation. It was a cold, piercing snowy day. I was preparing desserts for Mr. Jianming's publisher, who was visiting. I rode my bike to town early in the morning to buy some desserts. It was just in time that I ran into Mr. Julin at the pastry shop. He, like me, was picking out a local type of delicious, but with a short shelf life, daifuku. Just as we were about to leave, the sky began to snow heavily. This meant that I couldn't ride my bike back after all. I might even be stuck here for a long time, until he took out an umbrella and asked, "Do you want this?" I was a bit at a loss. He continued explaining. "The weather forecast says the snow will last for over 2 hours. I still have to work at the cafe across the street for half the day. I'll go back later." I still didn't dare to take it, until he added that the snow had stopped. "You can find a day and an opportunity to give it to me. You are a mate of the Jinguji family, right?" I nodded shyly. I thanked him and took the umbrella. I watched him jog away. I also walked back to the countryside road. The next day, the sky was clear and sunny. I also found an excuse to go out. Actually, it was to return the umbrella to Mr. Bamboo Grove's house, to increase our chances of meeting. At first, I knocked 4 or 5 times. I called his name several times. He didn't respond. But I thought he had already gone out. Finally, I dejectedly pressed the doorbell. He immediately opened the door. "Oh, it's Miss Yamada." He looked like he hadn't slept well. I thought it was the delivery. Sorry. I didn't pay attention to those details." We started chatting while standing in the shallow snow. Maybe we talked for less than 10 minutes. But my heart still flutters. Being able to talk to him once makes me happy for days. Those undead things are completely forgotten. Maybe my previous thoughts weren't quite right. Perhaps the beauty of these emotions can overshadow the sorrow of the haunting spirits. There was also fear. Just as the weather began to warm up, everything and my heart. Such warmth continued into the afternoon of that day. After lunch, I saw a young girl in the kitchen. She was completely naked. Her black hair hanging down to her waist. Her skin is pale. Unlike other lost souls, she is staring at me. She is staring at me, unblinking. Except for the child from earlier today, I have never seen such a young soul. Nor have I ever seen a soul with such heavy resentment. I can only keep telling myself, over and over again, pretend not to see. Just pretend not to see. But even though the work in my hands never stopped, her gaze never left. It was as if it was firmly nailed to me. My hands were shaking so much that I spilled fresh tea leaves all over the table, but I still forced myself to stay calm and muttered, "Okay, I'll go sit by the microwave for a bit." As I slowly turned my head, I was finally able to confirm that she had turned her back as well. My peripheral vision caught sight of the girl's bare back. She was slowly twirling her hair. Her pale nape revealed a very noticeable, large heart-shaped mole. Taking this opportunity, I quickly ran out of the kitchen. Under 20. That night, Natsum listened to my story. He paused the board game he was holding. He asked me, "That's too young." "Yeah, probably just a high school student. I thought you and your father would be used to it by now." He fiddled with the cards in his hand and said, "Not at all. At this age, it's the first time I've seen your turn, Akiho." I tried to learn the board game rules he brought back from university, but in the end, I realized that I couldn't focus on it at all. Finally, I spoke up and shared my thoughts. "Mr. Natsum, I have a strange feeling." He lifted his head from the pile of cards. "I think I've seen that girl before." He leaned back a little. "Answer me." "To be honest, I feel the same way." The next day, we found Mr. Jianming's newspaper. We went straight to the obituary section, but we only saw elderly people aged between 70 and 90. There was no obituary of any young girl. Really not. Natsum was almost desperate. He flipped through it a few more times. Mr. Norishige just answered slowly. Maybe it just wasn't fully included. But, the large heart-shaped mole on the back of his neck. Akiho and I both feel like we've seen it somewhere. Mr. Norishige seemed to freeze for a moment. He put the book down in his hand and walked back to the study. A few minutes later, he came back with a few printed papers. The reason it couldn't be found may not be because he is a deceased person. He handed those printed news pages to me and Natsum. "They say he might be a missing person. Dent if you are. I. That was a report on a missing person case from last February. It was about a local high school girl, the disappearance of Sasaki Sana. The face of that girl, those fragile eyes. Except that it's a little more delicate than the one I saw in the kitchen. There's no difference. There's no difference. This report not only has real photos, but also a simple sketch showing roughly what's behind Sasaki. No wonder we all felt like we'd seen it somewhere before, or heard about it." The three of us exchanged glances, because a possibility presented itself before us, and only those who live here can know and solve it. Those who appear in this house are all recently deceased, right? I no longer care about my identity. I directly questioned Mr. Jinming. He gave me, of course, this answer. That is to say, this young girl, Sasaki Sana, has been missing, but she has stayed in this town all along. She should not be in hiding, but rather, she was abducted and imprisoned. The person who took her might have only recently silenced her. We rushed to report it to the police. The Jinguji family's incredible abilities, locally, have become almost a special tool for the police in solving cases. But actually, I still have a theory I haven't told them. I think I've discovered more than just Sasaki's death. I may even know who imprisoned her and killed her. That person's face lingers in my mind, unable to fade away. In the following days, I never left the countryside, or rather, I didn't dare to go into town. I finally couldn't hold it in anymore. One night, while playing board games with Natsum, I asked my question. "Natsum, do you know someone named Takebayashi?" "I know," he replied without hesitation. "He's like my family. We've all been long-time residents of this town. I know this might sound a little absurd, but I've been thinking lately that maybe Mr. Bamboo kidnapped Sasaki." "Ah, why would you think that?" "He doesn't seem to be interested in board games anymore." He pushed aside the mahjong tiles and looked at me. I told Natsum about our encounters those days. One by one, the borrowing and returning of umbrellas. I treated everything I heard as clues, laying them all out. "Natsum, do you know? He bought 2 daifuku that day. That stuff spoils easily. It wouldn't last until the next day. But actually, for a grown man, eating 2 local specialty daifuku is quite normal. And also, their soundproofing must be very good. Because I kept knocking on the door and calling his name. He didn't respond. He probably heard me, but he was probably on his way to the door, right, Julin?" Their house isn't small either, but when Natsum opened the door, he was shocked to find it was me. That is to say, he didn't hear my voice at all. So, their house must have really good soundproofing. good enough to imprison a girl, without anyone noticing, right? My voice was loud enough to echo through the whole building. Natsum was also frightened. We slowly returned to silence and contemplation. I know Natsum doesn't believe me. He won't tell Mr. Denmei either. He told me. The Takebayashi family has been doing honest work for generations. Their family tradition has always been upright. Although now, only Shinichiro remains in their family. But I don't have to guess like this. Maybe I was just overthinking things. Until the next day, I was still absent-minded. After dinner, I took a walk around the hillside. The sun was setting. Suddenly, I saw a man, whom I hadn't seen in a long time, walking toward me. That was Shinichiro Takebayashi and Miss Akiho. He bowed, but he still startled me. I remained wary of him. Of course, he was completely unaware of this. I, however, always knew. The garden at the Jinguji family home is beautiful when the camellias are in bloom. I'm here to admire the flowers. I don't have any other intentions, really. I also want to take a look. What are you joking about? Isn't the young lady working right here? He's right. I'm so nervous that I'm starting to ramble. Actually, he let out a sigh of relief. The camellia always reminds me of my late lover. I find it a bit strange, because I've never heard the Jinguji father and son mention that Mr. Chikurin ever had a family. Were you married? Yes, I loved her very much. Behind Chikurin's glasses, an endless sadness appeared. Maybe I was just too suspicious before. I began to lower my guard. Rest in peace, sir. She must have been beautiful and kind. He sniffed. Thank you. She was beautiful. She was like this camellia. She even resembled my mother a little. Unfortunately, we only lived together for a year. She left me. I quickly bowed. I took a step back and said, sorry, sir. I asked too much. It's fine, Josie, she said with a smile. Thank you for being willing to accompany me to admire the flowers. Sakai's spirit is at peace. She must be happy too. I asked Saya without even thinking. Yes, that was my late wife's name. Forgive my outburst. I looked at Takebayashi's smile, but it felt increasingly strange. I said goodbye hastily, and left in a hurry. I ran into the house as fast as I could. I even left my wallet and house keys on the road. That night, Mr. Jianming scolded me for the first time. Even after I told him everything I experienced and my guesses, he still yelled at me. I was still upset about losing my entire set of keys. It wasn't until around 8 p.m. that night that the police knocked on the door. Only then did he completely change his mind. Thank you, Mr. Jinguji. If it weren't for you, we wouldn't have been able to obtain the information about the real culprit behind the kidnapping and murder of Sasaki. We found it through Mr. Tamiyaki's questioning. Zatum and I were listening in the living room. We learned from the police that they had gradually narrowed down the suspects, and finally found the culprit. It was Mr. Shinichiro Takabayashi. But when they entered Takabayashi's house a few hours ago, it was already empty. All that was left was a suicide note. It said that the Takebayashi house does indeed have a soundproof room. Traces of the girl's confinement were also found inside. Takebayashi usually uses a courier service to buy food and daily necessities for 2 people, so the people in the nearby town never noticed that their neighbor had another person living in their house. I remember when I went to return the umbrella. Sakai is locked behind the door. The bamboo forest stands between us. This sends a chill down my spine. His letter mentioned that his mother passed away early. So, when he first met a girl who resembled his mother, he fell in love with Sakai at first sight. He brought her back to his home. At first, the girl was terrified of him. But gradually, over time, feelings developed. The two eventually fell in love. However, 6 months ago, the result of their love quietly came into the world. But then, it was suddenly taken away. This blow was too much for the girl. After that, he became despondent. He ultimately committed suicide a few days ago. Is that really the case? That's just Julien's version of events. Kidnapping, imprisonment, rape, abortion. These are the terrifying words that haunt my mind. And that's not all. I also became aware of a fact. The child that Julien mentioned, Tenja, that day, was the 7th day after I arrived at the Jinguji family. In his will, he also said he no longer had the will to live. He wanted to leave, but he was afraid to die alone. He hoped to have someone accompany him to the afterlife. The handwriting suddenly ended here. The police are still searching for the whereabouts of the bamboo forest. They are following his will to search for his body. That night, Mr. Jianming apologized to me. Natsum also kept casting admiring glances at me. More importantly, my doubts were finally laid to rest. I fell asleep with peace of mind, but I was suddenly awakened in the middle of the night by a strange noise. There have been spirits in my room before. That's not unusual, but this time, it was Shinichiro Chikurin. He was glaring at me with intense hatred. His gaze was 100 times fiercer than the spirit of Miss Sanaz when she passed away. It was even 1,000 times more intense. Don't panic. Don't respond. I just need to act like nothing happened. Just like before, I silently tell myself that in the end, I'll close my eyes and drift off to sleep. The next day is my rare day off. Since the housekeeping company is coming for a thorough cleaning, I woke up very late. As I looked at the quiet courtyard, it was rare to see people coming and going. When the Shinji family father and son were sitting in the main hall chatting, I felt more at ease, or maybe it was because they were talking so seriously. Even when I sat down beside them, they didn't notice me at all. "Did the detective call you?" Father asked. "Yes," he told me. "The body in the bamboo forest was found. It was discovered this morning in a park in the city. He hanged himself." "That's terrible." I agree with Natsum. But on second thought, Mr. Tenmei said, only the spirits of those who died in town would appear in this field. Takebayashi committed suicide in the city at dawn. So the spirit that appeared at the Jinguji family's house last night couldn't have been his. I remembered the key I lost halfway up the mountain. I remembered the suicide note in the bamboo forest. I want to leave, but I'm afraid to die alone. I wish someone would accompany me to the afterlife. It's the season when the Sasanqua blossoms fall again. I finally understand now. Perhaps there's something good about their complete downfall. That was Yuenzi's belief that he was still alive. Still blooming, perhaps. Now, I am sitting alone, in a room on the 7th floor of an apartment, writing my final words. Kong. In these past years, I have confined myself here, finding any way I can to force myself to sleep for just a little while. I can't take it anymore. My mind and body have been severely damaged. I must reveal everything I've been through. It was back when I lived here. I received a letter from Sonia. She told me she'd recently heard rumors of an unexplored, wild cave. Asked me if I was interested in picking up the cave exploration gear from back in the day, and going for one last wild adventure before entering middle age. Of course, my answer was naturally yes. I don't know how the daily grind has been tormenting me. All I know is that back then, to make a living, I put aside the outdoor adventure gear I once loved so much, left in the bedroom, gathering dust for 2 or 3 years. Now it's finally time for them to see the sunlight. But how do you know no one's been down there? This was before I left. After I saw Sonia in the dining room, the first question I asked. There was half an hour until sunrise then. The sky is cloudless, yet shrouded in darkness. We ate breakfast while waiting for her husband, Phil, to join us. Sonia gave me the answer to my question, which also concerned Phil. He said it was discovered by a friend of my husband's, quite by chance. The location of this cave is, to say the least, rather odd. It's in the center of a farm. It's the farm and woods of their friend, a man named Jack Grayson. Jack said that once summer comes, his family's cows would march neatly to a certain spot in the field. They would gather around a small depression in the grass. After this happened for years, Jack couldn't contain his curiosity anymore, so he decided to investigate. Sonia leaned closer as she spoke, lowering her voice. Guess what I found? A hole, almost completely covered by weeds. But he could feel a cool breeze blowing steadily out of it. It even smelled a bit like burnt wood and metal. Then Jack started digging with a shovel, but after digging a few feet deep, they found that this was no ordinary small pit. It was the starting point to the depths of the earth. I couldn't help but laugh when I heard this. First, because I thought it was funny, and second, because I realized that Sonia hadn't changed a bit over the years. Sonia told me that Jack had named this place the Grayso Abyss. And we don't call him that. At first, I thought their grandiose talk was very childish. But now, looking back at my mockery and disdain from that time, I realized that the truly childish one was me. We finished our coffee at the end of the morning, and drove to the farm. It was early summer. The herd of cows had already begun the strange behavior she mentioned, circling around the field, resting or grazing. Jack Griso was waiting for us next to the herd of cows. Look at his thin and lethargic appearance. He really doesn't seem like someone who owns such vast farmlands and forests. Sonia and I started getting out of the car to gather our gear. We packed some basic supplies into our bags. Water, food, headlamps, ropes, spare batteries, and so on. Speaking of which, the overall number is not that large, because we didn't plan to stay down there for more than 7 hours. Once we finished organizing our luggage, we went up to accompany Jack. His dry, withered old face really startled me. It could be described as having a dead, lifeless expression, and that wouldn't be an exaggeration. "Jack," Sonia called out. He seemed to go deaf. He staggered and stood by the herd of cows. I quickly moved to where he was standing. I looked at the black hole 3 feet in front of his feet. This deep hole was like a black eye. It silently stared at us. Sonia suddenly called my name. I shifted my gaze back to Jack's face. I then realized, Jack's eyes were almost unfocused. More worrying was, his pupils were rapidly dilating, then contracting, then dilating again, over and over. When I was little, it could spread like a pinprick. When it spread, it was as exaggerated as the urban legend of the black-eyed children. That's when I realized something. We all thought this man was waiting for us. But what if he was trapped in this field by something? He's become so thin from not eating or drinking, he hasn't left. I nervously reached out to touch his shoulder. He was trembling all over. The veins on the side of his temple were also pulsing rapidly. The moment my hand touched him, he seemed to come alive all of a sudden. It was like waking up from a nightmare. He screamed, with those eyes completely dilated. His eyes, pupils devoid of whites, fixed on me. Sonia and I immediately took a step back. He didn't pursue us, didn't take another step forward. Instead, he scanned both of us, his gaze shifting from side to side. Finally, he raised his still trembling hand, pointing at my chest. "It's you," he said. "It's you who's going to unleash the nightmare. You're going to do it. Because this is your mission." It was when I realized he was speaking to my heart. Suddenly, he lost consciousness. His eyes rolled back. He collapsed to the ground. Sonia reacted faster than I did. She rushed forward first. She held on to the frail Mr. Gresso. Jack's breathing became abnormally slow. His throat still felt like it was cut open. He made a rattling, hoarse sound. I tried to help him up. But I saw a mass of bloody foam coming from his icy blue lips. Then he stopped breathing. Phil finally arrived a few minutes later. Unlike the extreme panic between the two of us, he was the first to check Jack's condition. Then he immediately made a phone call, and began directing me to perform CPR on Jack. Unfortunately, my efforts were all in vain. The arrival of the paramedics was also in vain. After they and the police handled the scene for an hour or two, in the end, it did leave us with an answer. Although it doesn't concern us, but our friend Jack has truly and utterly left us forever. Phil, who kept comforting us, finally couldn't hold back his discomfort, and said what a terrible start to the day this was. "Are we still going cave exploring?" Sonia and I exchanged a glance. Then she gave an answer that was both reasonable, yet unexpected. She said it was a must. A large area like Krasoga would soon be treated as property. It might be sold, or it could be handed over to the bank. If we don't seize this opportunity, we'll never have another chance to explore the cave. So I went along with it. I agreed. I don't believe in bad omens or anything. Even though I was really upset, I'd already decided to record my adventure. It's in memory of Jack. Maybe we can still find out the real cause of his sudden death. Phil saw me take out the GoPro, and realized I was serious. He sighed and said, "Who knows how deep this cave really is?" Sonia answered him. I tied the camera to a rope, reached down and extend once more. It only extended about 100 feet. At the beginning, the entire cave was very steep inside. The deeper we went, the flatter the rocks became. In any case, it wasn't difficult to climb, so we looked at each other. exchanged a smile, and got down to business. Phil was the first to put on his headlamp and small backpack, and crawl into the dark hole. After he had crawled down for several feet, Sonia started following, and then me. Finally, it was my turn. I watched their headlamps from the ground, the light gradually shrinking and dimming in the circular cave. I couldn't help but marvel. This hole is such a complete and perfect circle. If you tell me this wasn't man-made, I wouldn't believe it. After taking a deep breath, I followed them into the darkness. While climbing down, I joked, saying that this place isn't too bad. Probably a bit wider than a coffin. It seems we're not dead yet. Sonia shouted from below, going further down will only get easier. I mimicked her tone and asked, how do you know it'll be easier? You've never been here before, right? I just guessed. There was a hint of a smile in Sonia's voice. A few seconds later, we all heard Phil's voice from far below, carried up to us. Even though he was very far away, we still heard what he said, echoing up. He'd reached the bottom. It's really much more open down there, Phil told us. It's just that this place is a bit strange. Upon hearing this, Sonia immediately accelerated downward. What does that mean? His tone sounded like someone expecting a surprise. I feel the same. What adventure seeks is this kind of unexpected joy. We quickly climbed to the bottom, but the scene in front of us was truly beyond my imagination. The granite floor we walk on stretches far into the distance. The entire underground tunnel takes the shape of a cut equilateral triangle. Each side is about 7 feet long. The ceiling and walls are made of smooth gray rock. Above, it seems as if thousands of black spheres are hidden. They look like obsidian, like eyes. Each one is the size of an orange. They stretch endlessly. A city. What is this place? Sonia said, cautiously taking a step forward. She moved into a place where the sunlight couldn't reach. Phil ran back and asked, hey, are you still filming? I pointed to the GoPro and asked, this? Yeah. This could generate huge traffic value if filmed. Posting it online could make a lot of money. But I suddenly thought of something. I paused the recording and said, Phil, what do you think about what Jack said before he died? Are you kidding me? He looked down and said, I don't think so. Jack is usually pretty humorous. But I just didn't think he would be before he died. We fell silent afterward. Unconsciously, we followed Sonia. We went through the triangular tunnel. During this time, the two of them gave various speculations about this tunnel. An ancient alien civilization. A masterpiece by scientists from the past. This adventurous couple seemed to have endless things to talk about, until we reached a strange statue. Then they all fell silent. What is that thing? I shone the flashlight towards the statue. That thing was almost 20 feet tall. It was nearly touching the top of the tunnel. The lower half was a giant spider, with dozens of jointed legs. But the upper half was an elongated human spine. It extended upwards. At the very top of that spine, there seemed to be a sharpened skull, full of cracks, hidden in the dark. We all held our breath. Not a sound was made, but when one of the giant's insect legs twitched, we realized it wasn't a statue. It's a living thing. More and more giant insect legs sway. It's like a dripping candle, repeatedly melting and reforming. That skull hidden in the distance finally slowly begins to reach towards us. In the eye sockets of that head, there are no eyes. Instead, there was an eyeball on his forehead. He grinned, slowly bringing his face closer to us, as if proudly admiring. The look of surprise on our faces at his ever-changing appearance. I was indeed surprised. I believe Sonia and Phil were, too. What we saw before us, it can't be described as an animal, or even as a living being. It completely exceeds the limits of my understanding. I can even feel the fear, like icy waves constantly surging from its body. Release me. I hear this voice. Not from my ears. I can't even tell where it's coming from. But I knew it was the colossal being before me speaking. Release me, and I will give you the water of eternal life. I will give you the seeds of immortality. We can live forever in the nightmare. We will never feel lonely again. Who are you? I asked in terror. Its enormous face leaned closer. The sharp teeth in his mouth became even clearer. I have many names. In that moment, I seemed to hear thousands of voices from him. When this planet was just an ocean, I was already here. Once, the saints who sought me. Those ancient humans. Call me Nira Ilahos. Obviously, Phil also heard his voice. He asked, "How do you want us to release you?" It's simple. Let me into you, and you can. On a psychological and physical level. I am trapped in this prison. I can't leave. But relying on your life, I can spread it outside. I'll protect Sonia and Phil with all my strength. A decisive answer. You think it's all very nice, but sorry, it's impossible. Sonia finally spoke up. Right, it's impossible. We should leave. I'm just afraid you two won't be able to leave. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the rocky tunnel. It was as if deep inside, a blacksmith was madly hammering an anvil. Immediately after, we realized that the sound was coming from above us. The rocks, covered in black, eyeball-like orbs, collapsed and shattered, colliding with each other. A burst of blue firelight shot out. It smashed toward us. Phil shouted and ran back toward us. He didn't forget to pull Sonia's arm. Of course, I understand. In a moment of desperation, he would definitely choose to save his wife. He couldn't worry about me. But the real reason I was terrified was, he seemed to be running toward the source of the collapse. Wait a minute. I haven't finished yet. My voice was drowned out by the surrounding noises. A rock hit my shoulder hard, throwing me to the ground. Even with the loud rolling stones, I still heard. Phil let out a painful scream. Then, another stone hit me on the forehead. In an instant, I lost the energy to care about them, or the outside world. I just felt the world spinning. My vision went dark. By the time I regained consciousness, I realized my headlamp was still brightly on, making the dust in the collapsed tunnel clearly visible. I was lying among large and small stones, and, of course, there were quite a few on me too. When I lifted my head, a sharp, burning pain shot through my forehead. I groaned and touched my head. Blood was already flowing from the wound, down to my left temple. Apart from that, there are quite a few wounds on my shoulders and back. Fortunately, none of them are fatal. I crawled up, and whispered, "Sonia." My throat was almost clogged with dust. I quickly took a sip of water. Ask again. Phil. After taking a few more steps, I seemed to hear a faint crying sound. It was Sonia. Her injuries were much more severe than mine, but she paid no attention to herself. She was sitting beside Phil's prone body, crying. Phil had one arm. He's trapped under the huge rock slab. Blood is continuously oozing out from beneath the stone. Max. Sonia sobbed, calling out my name. Phil is seriously injured. I already know that without being told. Phil's consciousness is fading. His face is pale. We don't have the equipment to save him. The only way is to escape and find help. But when I looked back the way we came, the entire tunnel was completely blocked by those huge stones covered in black spheres, like countless black eyes, staring at us, watching us descend into despair. Under that gaze, we spent about a day. My phone lost signal deep underground. Now, its battery is finally dead. Only endless darkness remains, heavy breathing and useless tears. Phil is on the brink of death. We can't treat his injuries. His whole arm is rotting and black. Letting this go on is definitely not a good solution. But, when we told him that we had to amputate his hand, he was already delirious and gave incoherent answers. I really don't know if in this condition, he'll be able to survive this emergency surgery. We took out the useless items from our bags, and started a fire to light up a small area. Performing surgery on Phil in such light is extremely difficult. It would be even harder for his wife to do it. So the responsibility fell on me. I heated the knife with a flame, and tied a rope around Phil's arm. To control the bleeding later. Anesthesia may no longer be necessary. Because he's completely lost his soul. He keeps muttering things I can't understand. We need to look around. He must be here. He's still here. I looked into his eyes and said, "Phil, can you hear me? I'm going to fix your arm now. Will you cooperate with me?" He didn't answer me. I didn't expect him to answer either. I began the procedure directly. I never imagined an emergency amputation would be this difficult. It wasn't just the black blood, the repeatedly surging out. Phil's already decayed and infected tissue will keep oozing pus. These 3 or 4 minutes of cutting back and forth, I felt like I had experienced hours. Phil was also screaming and begging repeatedly. It seems he still has some instinctive resistance. That is a response from the depths of his heart to extreme pain. Finally, we saw the bone. By this time, my gloves were also soaked through with deep red. We can't stop. We must finish this job in one go, then quickly bandage Phil. After seeing the bone, I picked up Phil's steel-toed work boots from his bag, and slammed them down hard on the bone. A couple of swift strikes. The bone finally shattered under the heavy pressure. It made a sound like a twig snapping. In that moment, Phil was like someone bound to a massive rock. Suddenly, he was released. He tumbled to a different spot in an instant. He looked at the rotten, severed arm. I spent quite a while. I had just calmed down from the dizziness and nausea. But when I reached out my hand to ask Sonia for the tool to cauterize the severed arm, she hesitated. "Sonia, give it to me. Be strong." I shouted louder. "If you just sit there and stare, your husband will bleed to death." The echo drifts everywhere. At that time, I was filled with more confusion. This woman in front of me, my only partner now. She used to be such a capable and brave outdoor adventurer. How could she be so out of character now? I cursed her. Because in this state, she can't be of any help. I curse her. Sonia suddenly handed over the already red-hot stag knife. It interrupted my excited emotions. It was also this knife that, when pressed against Phil's arm, made a sizzling sound and the smell of burning flesh. It ended this gruesome, desperate rescue. Sonia began to hold Phil, whose breathing was gradually returning to normal. I fed him the medicine. Watching the two of them, that strange feeling began to gnaw at my mind again. Phil is lucky. Not because I saved him. He doesn't have much time left. He'll die in a daze. It's his good fortune. Not like Sonia and I, who will slowly starve or die of thirst while awake, day by day. Sonia. Sonia. That bastard Phil. How does he deserve such a beautiful partner? If I were starving to death, I would eat you all. Hunger and madness will drive me forward. I was driven to swallow the cold, raw chunks of meat, especially Sonia. I fell asleep in a strange mood. At that time, I had a dream. I dreamt of an immensely huge deity. His body constantly melted like candle wax. His face was thus impossible to see clearly. He sat amidst countless starving people, among those with a thin physique. Of course, I am included. He seemed to be judging us, pointing fingers at us. When he pointed at me, I woke up. There was no one around me. To be precise, there were no living people. Phil was lying right next to me, all alone. That was his body. His heart. In the time it took for me to blink, he had already died from septic shock. The black streaks from his wound spread along his arm, towards his heart. Those eyes, now vacant, staring blankly at the rock ceiling. Where's Sonia? I accepted reality. I woke up. But unfortunately, my headlamp is getting dimmer and dimmer. The spare batteries are almost gone. In this dim cave, I saw someone walking out. That's Sonia. A frail and withered figure. She didn't know why, but she was trembling violently. I saw them. Max. Her lips were trembling. Naira Lahose and his priests. His priests are not human. They look like a group of reptiles. Their mouths aren't in the front. They have eyes. They have many eyes. She babbled incoherently. Then she shivered. She reached out and grabbed my arm. Do you know? We can't leave alive. If we're going to leave, we must bring this nightmare with us. We must go to the surface and spread his nightmare. I grabbed her firmly, comforting my old friend, who had lost her mind. I said, don't go crazy. Calm down, okay? She calmed down a little. She nodded in my arms. Time was elusive in the darkness. It seems like I fell asleep again after that. When I woke up the next day, I found that this time Sonia was holding something, and murmuring to herself. I wasn't wrong. Not at all. I was right. I waited until I got closer to look. I realized she was holding Phil's corpse, already starting to decay. Her tongue was swollen and blue, and her lips were purple. But the muttering never stopped. Shortly after that, I can no longer hear her voice. She committed suicide. Now, I am here with the bodies of 2 friends, in this cramped underground chamber. My headlamp is completely dead. My food is gone. I have only a small sip of water left. It's exactly as I feared. What remained was endless despair and hunger. No. There's something else. It's like something running along the rock face in the darkness. I think I also heard the sound of Nila Ilaho's China, and the sound of his body melting and changing. I don't even remember the last time I spoke. In the maddening darkness, a hissing sound emerged. Chess, you are already at the doorstep of death. Aren't you willing to turn back and drink from the spring of life? I can't tell where the sound is coming from. It feels like it's coming from all directions. It was as if the words came from my own mouth. I started to laugh. I laughed with unrestrained joy, like I had grasped a lifeline. Then I started crying as I laughed. I would. Of course I would. I begged Nila to take me away from there. Sadly, I received no answer. Silence fell again. After about a few dozen seconds, a shrill, piercing laugh suddenly cut through the air. Before me, a whirlwind like a shower of sparks descended from the top of the cliff, surrounding Neuralathos, who resembled a spider. He descended before me again. He raised an arm, nothing but bone and devoid of flesh. Instantly, the surroundings became inexplicably bright. He reached into the still unsettled wind, as if sensing something, then withdrew his hand, holding a tiny, spinning black sphere. He offered it to my chest. Weren't those the black eyes from within the rocks? Nightmare seed. He chuckled and shoved it into my mouth. I don't remember when I opened my mouth. I only knew I was starving to death. Swallowing that bead was like swallowing the most exquisite delicacy. But in an instant, my stress, fatigue, and thirst vanished. My hunger, it was like a release. Overflowing my whole body, I started to feel dizzy. It felt like a fire was burning inside me, consuming my insides. City. I tried to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. Wind. It was just that in the midst of chaos, I knelt on the ground. Neuralaho's only focus was looking at me in front of him. He laughed at me loudly. In the end, I was found by the people handling Jack's farm inheritance. They found me in the fields. They said. At that time, I was kneeling naked in the fields. It was like an intense struggle, rolling and screaming in agony. Soon after, I realized that my life would never return to the way it was. No matter where I went, I could always hear the hissing sound of Neuralaho's presence, and I could see those running shadows. It was like some enormous creature with a spider's body was constantly following me. Every night, I leave a light on when I sleep. But when I wake up from nightmares, they're always inexplicably turned off. Replacing the light is a seemingly endless darkness, and the melting legs of Nila Ilahash. And that face, even today, as I write these words, I can still feel it spreading in my heart. It crawls through my veins. I think I understand what he meant by spreading nightmares. It's the moment I couldn't bear the torment and jumped off the windowsill. When I was shattered. The seed I brought out from the depths of the Greasaw pit. It will break through the confines of the body, and spread into the outside world. It will extend out towards all of you. Make. City. Wind. Magnetism. Reduction. Alkali. City. City. Dear Mr. Godfrey. First, I'd like to congratulate you on your new appointment. I also firmly believe that in the future you will make an invaluable contribution to our community. I think, when Mr. Dono resigned before you, if the office's inbox was not cleaned out, you would have been surprised by the pile of letters nearly overflowing the inbox. But I believe, Mr. Godfrey, please don't think that there is a major issue in our community. On the contrary, our Pamian community has long enjoyed stable security and a beautiful environment. It's a place deeply loved by the vast majority of salaried workers. I have to admit, these letters are basically feedback on problems stemming from the Snow family, purpose, and thus, the whole story behind this matter. I need to write to inform you. I hope to borrow Mr. Godfrey's valuable time to read this long letter. Purpose. My name is Leiden Snow, About 2 years ago, I divorced my beloved wife. The court awarded me custody of my son, Kujie. To escape the old house that broke my heart, I started looking for a new one. The only silver lining was that the real estate agent introduced me to. Now, in the Pamian community, there is a standalone house. It comes with a parking garage and a beautiful front yard. Everything is almost perfect. A lovely environment and harmonious neighbors. I am very satisfied with all of this, so I quickly completed the house handover process. With hopes for my new life ahead, I, along with my 5-year-old son, I moved into a new home in the Pamian community. During the first year after moving in, I had to deal with a series of follow-up issues that arose after leaving the old community. There were urgent matters that required my attention. I had to take care of Kugi's school transfer. And I also needed to submit a request to my company to transfer out of the Pamian community, application for the closer branch work. At the same time, there are also a series of follow-up procedures for property transfer, and the repayment of the loan for purchasing a new house, and so on and so forth. This led to me, after the furniture was set up, hiring temporary housekeepers to complete their cleaning and organizing tasks. I spent most of my time out and about. According to my plan, after I complete a series of follow-up tasks, my life will get back on track. In this pleasant community, I will gradually forget the pain caused by my wife's departure. I've repaired those mental issues that almost made Kuji leave me. Everything will return to how it was, a happy life. Every day is the same. I wake up and stock the fridge with instant ramen, some barley bread, and sliced ham. After breakfast, I take little Kuji to school, then work until 9 p.m. Although Kuji is only about 5 years old, his sense of direction has always been excellent. He's only lived in the community for a short while, but he already knows the route from the school bus stop to our house. Plus, the community is extremely safe, and security is very good. That's why I feel so at ease about Kuji going home from school by himself. It only lasted for about 3 months. Then some small changes appeared in my life. First of all, it involved my son, Kuji. Because I was so busy with work, I had almost no idea how his social circle at school was going. I was practically in the dark. The only thing I knew was, once, before going to bed, little Kuji told me that he had made 7 friends of foreign descent. Although communication between them was still quite difficult, they really enjoyed learning a few nursery rhymes with little Kuji. From little Kuji's description, there were some doubts mixed in, but I was more pleased that little Kuji had made a friend, because little Kuji suggested using drawing as a way to document his new life. I gladly agreed. The next evening, while buying instant noodles and sliced ham, I also picked up a brand new box of 56 color watercolor pens for little Kuji. He was very pleased with it, but I also imposed a ban on him. The walls of the house were painted by me at a high cost. In any case, no one is allowed to paint or draw on the walls of the house. I think the authority I have at home still carries weight. Because I'm sure little Kuki dared not break my iron rule, but my authority seemed to last only a week. On the Tuesday a week later, when I came home, a glaring graffiti, like a soft thorn, pricked my vision. It was on the wall of the kitchen cupboard. It was clearly drawn with a red watercolor pen, the arrow points. Thinking back now, I must have been under immense pressure at work. Coupled with the ironclad rules I had as a father, I faced serious doubts. I clearly lost my rational thinking at the time. Before my son could even offer any explanation, I was already like a rabid beast. I rushed into his room, and repeatedly questioned me if I had told you not to use watercolor pens for certain things. Even though I took responsibility, and paid the price of making little Kuki cry all night, I still heartlessly threw away his entire set of watercolor pens, and I threatened him not to go digging through the trash for the watercolor pens I had thrown away. On the second day, before I had the painter come to repaint it, above the red arrow from yesterday, another arrow appeared. Only this time, it was drawn in orange, and it pointed downwards. Seeing this, I again lost my reason. Instead, I judged him out of anger. I was certain it was my son. I went to the trash can to search for the watercolors. Even though he had the courage to explain to me that it was his friend's actions, I didn't give my child any trust at all. I took out Coogie's remaining fountain pens and locked him in the room. I decided to let him go hungry for a day as punishment. And I indeed did so. On the third day, I applied for leave from his homeroom teacher. I locked him in the room. Then I left to do my work. Yes, from that moment on, it seemed I became a little uncontrollable emotionally. It wasn't until the end of my third day at work that I finally snapped out of the uncontrollable anger and even regret. This is not how a father should behave. And if I don't quickly fix my relationship with Cookie, then what will come next is the staff of the Women and Children's Welfare Committee. So, after work, I specifically went to the pizza shop and bought his favorite mozzarella cheese pizza. I also stopped by the store to buy a new box of watercolor pens, and when I pushed open the dimly lit front door of the house, I had already prepared what I would say to apologize to him, but the situation that followed was not what I had expected. Quiet and faint sobbing in the pitch-black, inky room. A faint, childish humming of a lullaby could be heard. The lullaby seemed to be coming closer. Finally, I was sure. It was coming from my child, from little Coogie's room. I couldn't react in time. I immediately rushed to his door. I opened the lock on his door. Perhaps the person singing inside heard me turning the lock. The sound of the nursery rhyme stopped abruptly. The moment I opened the door, there was no one in the room but little Coogie. Little Coogie was lying on his bed. He fell fast asleep. 2 streaks of dried tears still remained on his face. At that moment, I felt immense guilt. I instantly forgot the astonishment and doubt the lullaby had brought me. I went forward and gently woke my son, to the still drowsy little Coogie. I expressed my apologies. I feel so lucky to face my dad, who's become gentle again. The brand new pencil case and the smell of pizza. Little Coogie accepted my apology. So, I took my son and walked into the kitchen to get ready for a late night snack. Just as I was turning the microwave knob to heat up the pizza, I looked up and saw a new yellow crayon arrow. I shuddered. It was like a current of electricity surging through my brain. The appearance of this arrow, undoubtedly, shattered all my previous deductions about its origin. I wrongly accused my child. At the same time, there was a third intruder in my room. Could this be related to the nursery rhyme I first heard? At that moment, the microwave finished heating the pizza, and it interrupted my thoughts. I placed the heated pizza in front of little Cookie. I watched as he eagerly began to devour it. I asked, "Baby, when did you hear the children's song just now?" He answered seriously in his childish voice. "It was probably my friends singing. They like to sing at night. The songs are the ones my mom used to hum to me before bed. They're the few I know best. I just taught them to sing. It's just that I couldn't understand a word they were singing." The word, friend, underwent a rapid retrieval in my mind. It quickly matched what Kukuj had told me earlier. Those foreign friends he learned to sing from. I suddenly remembered that although I threw away his colored pencils, the paintings he used to record his life should still be kept. I got little Coogie's consent and walked into his room. I found the sketchbook he used to record things. I started flipping through it. Most of the content was about life at school and the view outside the window from his room. There were also some childlike drawings featuring trees, clouds, houses, rainbows, and the sun. Finally, among dozens of pictures, I found one that might be related to the friend that little Coogie mentioned. It was a picture with the theme of holding hands. The little boy with white skin in the picture should be my son. The other people were drawn with black crayons. I drew 7 almost identical human figures without facial features. Perhaps they are the foreign friends little Coogie mentioned. I quickly connected this to the possibility that little Coogie's friends are all of African descent. That's why I painted them black. Also, this painting has another very strange aspect to me. The people in the picture are holding hands, with their heads touching, forming a circle. Around them, there are drawings of what seem like mountains and houses. There's also an unclear object inside the circle. Maybe it's because children lack a sense of three-dimensional space and have overflowing imaginations. I comfort myself this way, but subconsciously, some stereotypes I have about foreign foot massages. still make me involuntarily connect the arrows in the house, with the singing in Xiao Cookie's room, and the voodoo in faraway Africa, with mysticism. This made me have to keep an eye on the identities of several of Xiao Cookie's foreign friends. During my breaks at work, I called Cookie's teacher. I learned on the phone that Cookie's school is far from predominantly black neighborhoods, and also because there aren't many black people in the Pamian community. Therefore, the total number of black students in the entire school across all grades could be counted on one hand. And Zayakuji had a hard time fitting in at school because he was a transfer student. He found it difficult to make friends, therefore, he hadn't made any friends. After learning these basic facts, I hung up the phone with a heavy heart. In other words, the friend my son made might be an outsider who's been moving around our neighborhood. They may even come from afar. Perhaps they were once an ancient race that extended across that land. However, modern society has fragmented them, consuming them bit by bit. From then on, they could only rely on infiltrating various communities to become part of modern society. But Mr. Godfrey, I have to admit to you that I hold certain biases and prejudices when it comes to views about foreigners, but these seemingly irrational and absurd assumptions aren't without reason. After work that day, I went out and bought a series of locks to install on all the doors and windows I could. All the doors were locked. I even took little Kuji with me when I went out. We spent the entire weekend together. But unbelievably, something happened. New arrows drawn with watercolor pens still appeared in the house. Even though I called the police about it, hoping they would handle the situation. There have been incidents of trespass and unauthorized entry, but the police don't believe me. They don't believe my deduction that it might involve an African American child with possible occult knowledge. That ludicrous deduction. They showed me the security footage from the past few days and assured me that there were no signs of forced entry into my house. But I really can't believe, even after the police left, there were still crayon arrows in my house. And they increased every day. This would make me call a painter again to repaint the walls. An incredibly stupid idea. What's even more maddening is, the neighbors around me have already started complaining to the community about me. They say my house disturbs the peace at night, with the sounds of children singing nursery rhymes. Although it's not intentional on my part, I almost ended up under new investigation by the court because of these reports. But of course, the above is just something I can't explain. It was just a minor prelude before the encounter. These things didn't last more than a week. They were almost perfectly handled by Mr. Dono. I think you should know Mr. Dono. He was the little old man who served as the community office director before you. He always wore a pleasant smile and would greet you, asking if the weather was nice today. A charming old gentleman from the south. He not only handled the complaints and reports about my house in a short time, but also in a short time sent away those media people who came to watch, smelling a sensational story. At the same time, he kept news about my house strictly under wraps, out of gratitude for Mr. Dono's help. I also purchased a gift for him, along with a thank you letter. Mr. Dono enthusiastically replied to my thanks, and explained to me that he was able to resolve the matter so quickly because of similar past experiences. After dealing with previous tenants, I've accumulated some experience and methods for handling things. The letter also included an SD card. Mr. Donahoe said that he bought it for $70 from a YouTuber. An unuploaded video. It should explain what I mentioned in passing in my thank you note. Speculations about the mixed-race child. I turned on my computer. The video shows it was filmed 5 years ago. That is, when my previous tenant lived in this house. The content is an exterior view of my house. The house was dark at that time, repeatedly chewed over in the languid darkness of midnight. Then came a series of tones, seeming to come from afar. A string of what sounded like children's voices, in a language I couldn't understand at all, in a completely off-key manner, chanting a word that seemed to be a name. This name shot through my mind like an electric current. It was the same name I'd heard sung in the lullaby after I put little Kuji in solitary confinement that day. I had heard it sung in the lullaby. The name is different from the previous occupant. What I heard seemed to be a version of a familiar song. Plus, little Kuki had previously explained to me That those arrows were the work of his friends. So, the arrows in the rooms of those foreign children, and the songs heard at midnight, all made sense and were connected, but these still don't explain my final question. Who are they really? What are the purposes behind their actions? The next few months were the same. The arrows on my wall kept increasing. Over time, I even started to figure out their patterns. For example, from Monday to Sunday, it corresponded to the 7 colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. The arrows seemed to point in the same direction every week. They seemed to be pointing at something unknown. Over time, judging from the increasingly higher position of the arrows in the room, this thing seems to be growing. And it's growing at a speed imperceptible to the naked eye. It's growing, if such a thing truly exists, an indescribable filthy monster. How evil and corrupt this house must be. I quickly interrupted myself. Those nauseating thoughts. For the past month, neither I nor little Kuji's health has shown any signs of discomfort. Speculations about the monster. It only stays in my subconscious. Nameless guesses and fantasies. Maybe it's because they ruined my new house. The freshly painted bright walls. Or maybe it's the arrows on the walls that give off a feeling of restlessness. In any case, I still can't feel comfortable around those strange foreign children. I can't trust them at all. I don't even know when it started. But I've developed an instinctive feeling of disgust towards them. From the bottom of my heart, I want to push them 1,000 miles away, even though, in some sense, they are my son's friends. Little Kuki, as a child, I still possess the ability to read my parents' expressions. I do. Since he mentioned his friend in front of me once, he must have noticed the anger in my eyes. He hasn't mentioned it again. But those children aren't afraid of my malice. The colored arrows on the wall continue to increase daily. Carrying the tune of a children's song, a Puss in Boots call. There are still intervals of 2 to 3 days when sounds from our house reach my ears. They drill into my eardrums. On several nights, I have gotten up. I can see, inside and outside the house. Suddenly, a few small dark figures flash by. My gaze follows them, until they disappear, on the secluded midnight streets of the Pamian community. If you look up, you can see the moonlight filtering through the tree branches, casting countless fragmented shadows, as if there are countless eyes peering inside the houses. And I know that among those gazes, there must be some from the children. I thought of those who had helped me earlier. Community Office Director, Mr. Dono, as a director with over 30 years of experience, regarding the past events that once occurred in my house. Perhaps Mr. Dono might know something about it. So I wrote a letter, telling old Dono about my many confusions after moving into the new house. Mr. Dono replied to me a week later. He briefly told me that he was indeed aware of some unverified rumors. However, it was inconvenient to present them in writing. If I wanted to know more, it would be best to schedule a time during the afternoon break, and chat on a bench in Central Park of the Pamian community. Talk then. In the end, we settled on meeting one Sunday afternoon. Both sides arrived on time at the park. On a shaded bench. Old Dono was still the same as always. He greeted me by asking if the sun was nice today. We exchanged a few pleasantries and then sat down. He started talking about the history behind my house, some past events that I had never known about. My house can be traced back in time, to the exact period when the Pamian community was established. Coincidentally, Mr. Dono was one of the first people to develop the Pamian community. Because of this, he witnessed the transformation of the community from undeveloped wasteland to the livable mid to high-end community it is today. As for the events before the construction of my house, it seems that Mr. Dono deliberately avoids recalling them. Maybe I'm getting old. Sometimes, I tend to confuse some unspeakable nightmares with memories from over 30 years ago. The sunlight is just right, warm and gentle. I can even smell a hint of wool. I saw Mr. Donovan beside me, narrowing his eyes slightly, seriously explaining to me. It was when the workers started the machines and began digging the land to lay the foundation. During the digging process, they seemed to have uncovered something hard. Everyone once thought that they might have touched the rock layers, But later, it was confirmed to be a solid boulder. At that time, he was with his family, supervising the engineering project in that area. But when he saw that boulder, perhaps because of earlier years, at the University of California, I've taken a few courses on semiotics. He quickly noticed that the surface of the megalith seemed to be engraved with patterns resembling symbols. But he wasn't an expert in this field. After all, he couldn't immediately determine which ancient civilization's symbols they were. I made a decision at that time. I can't really judge whether it was the right or wrong decision. I paused the work at the construction site and called my professor at the University of California to tell him about the strange discovery we made at the construction site. It took about half an hour. My professor, several excited, speechless archaeology professors, also appeared at the scene. The moment they saw the giant stone, those professors couldn't come to a conclusion right away. An hour later, the archaeology team that came to assist with the excavation also brought professional equipment to the site. Through underground detection, it was confirmed that a large rectangular stone was found. After about a week of careful excavation, a massive stone, approximately 100 cubic meters in size, was unearthed. The entire stone was engraved with symbols of unclear meaning. When he saw the full extent of the stone, a sense of unease and foreboding washed over him. From within this airtight boulder, something is seeping out. It seems to be telling him that this is a Pandora's box that must not be spread. He learned from a conversation between the professors nearby that the boulder, after being examined, was found to be hollow. It might contain some substances that current machines are unable to detect. Because of the massive size of the stone, we need to conduct a preliminary examination and cut it before we can take it back for detailed study. The preliminary results surprised everyone. Based on the isotopic analysis of the stone's surface, this stone can be traced back to 70 million years ago, far exceeding known human history. Everyone was shocked by this result. It displayed different emotions. It seemed like an argument between optimists and pessimists. Regarding the civilization behind the monolith, they were having a heated discussion. However, this didn't mean much to him. At the time, he just wanted to quickly finish the survey here and have the ominous monolith transported back, so that the development work on his side could continue. 3 days later, the archaeological team officially began cutting the giant stone. As the person in charge of overseeing the development of the Pamian community, I was also invited to witness the initial results of the on-site work. The cutting site was simple, yet ceremonial. Some people used red ribbons. They also tied several simple fireworks. Several professors shared their guesses about the contents inside the boulder. They began speculating. In any case, before the cutting machine sliced open the boulder, the atmosphere on site was filled with joy and excitement. Then the cutting machine started up. After a muffled sound, the boulder was officially cut open. Everyone rushed in, wanting to see what was going on, but most left disappointed. Because almost everyone saw only an empty void within. Except for one person. I don't remember his name, but I still remember him. He's the one I met during university, the professor of semiotics course. Years passed. There wasn't much change. But at the moment the stone was cut open, I felt he seemed to have become a different person. He no longer seemed like the rational, rigorous scholar. He was more like a fervent believer. Staring into the stone, it seems to exist as the supreme being of a void space. Muttering an inexplicable name. Pusati. When I heard this name again, I suddenly felt that the afternoon sunlight was so cold and piercing. It wasn't just me, but also my professor from back then. We also noticed the abnormal behavior of the semiotics professor. Just as he was about to go mad and rush toward the stone, we pulled him back together. Soon, the staff on site, along with the professor, came over. They helped them restrain the raging semiotics professor. The terrifying strength he unleashed at that moment. I could feel it in my bones. That urgent, driving force. Naturally, it wasn't him. Old Dono wouldn't even have imagined that he would later murder almost all the on-site staff present. And 7 of them had their eyes gouged out. Used in some kind of cult ritual. Of the 7, including his innocent mentor, the professor, when the police arrested the semiotics teacher. He was in the house you're living in now, performing a bizarre occult ritual. At the time of his arrest, he was still muttering strange things incessantly. He claimed he had awakened Sasuti. Humankind will usher in the arrival of a great union. That mad semiotics professor, until his death, in a California state prison, never revealed to the outside world why he had gone mad. He saw something that no ordinary person had ever seen. Then, for days, the first batch of residents in the Pamian community had all given feedback to old Dono. They said that the house I'm currently living in always emits disgusting, evil, unbearable noises. Even the previous tenant of my neighbor's house submitted a report on intruders to him. They claimed that around my house, a large number of unidentified intruders have appeared. That's about it. Having said that, Mr. Dono rose from the bench. After stretching, he handed me an envelope. He said to me, "In the University of California library, there's a book that used to be in Arkham University's collection. I think if you could access that book, perhaps you can find the answers you're looking for in there." One last thing. Those kids, although I'm not sure who they are, or what lies behind their actions, I think young people deserve a bit of trust. After all, so far, other than occasionally disturbing the peace, they haven't caused any substantial harm. Oh. Goodbye. Young man, enjoy the sun before sunset. Have a wonderful day. I said goodbye to Mr. Dono. On a park bench, I opened the letter Mr. Dono had just given me. From the moment I received the envelope, I could sense the age of this letter. And there is a mark on this letter that was cut open with a paper cutter, and then glued back together. Clearly, this seems to be a letter that Mr. Dono might have read before. I took out the letter inside, and quickly skimmed through the general content. If I'm not mistaken, that should be a letter from a former resident named Makaraturi, reporting a problem to Mr. Dono. Makaraturi's experience in his room seems, for now, to be almost identical to my experience in my room. Both involve strange arrows, and both heard eerie songs in the middle of the night. The difference is, the arrows in the house of Makaraturi seem to have been drawn with ketchup, salad dressing, ink from ink bottles, and other liquids. And the resident, Makaraturi, moved into this house as a single man. As for me, I live here with my son, little Cookie. Perhaps it's because of the child that my child ended up having contact with them. Perhaps I should have asked little Cookie about their story a long time ago, but for some reason, whenever I was in the house, I felt such strong dislike towards those foreign children. What's more, because of those people, my relationship with little Cookie became really unpleasant. It caused a lot of tension between us. I picked up the letter again, and saw what was written on the back of the paper. A pen had written these words: "The biggest mistake of my life was helping a strange, unfamiliar person, and flipping through the 2 books he carried. I had planned to bury this secret forever, and wait for some future moment. It would be nice if someone could offer a solution. But the truth is, it was an incredibly stupid mistake. If one day I disappear, or go insane, remember that in the wall cavity of the house, 2 yellowed books are hidden. Please retrieve them before the next tenant moves in. Find it and burn it." The time is already nearing evening. The warmth carried by the sunlight slowly fades away from the surface of my body. It makes me feel a bit lost in thought. By the time I snap back to reality, I find that the sunlight has already vanished. In the darkness of night, the murky and chaotic blackness, it's crawling all over this world. Alright, from this moment on, I completely believe it. There is definitely something wrong with my house. All the signs are confirming the hidden taboos and malice in this house. But right now, I find myself in a dilemma. I want to move, but right now, my circumstances don't allow me to move anywhere new. On the one hand, the loan for my house in the Pamian community hasn't been paid off yet, and selling the house in the short term is almost impossible. Yes, Mr. Godfrey, if you step away from the perspective of the elite and try to understand what I'm saying, you'll easily see that in today's social environment, I still need to constantly face the test of layoffs. On my own, I naturally can't withstand such upheaval, and the most that can happen to the house is that it will have crayon arrows drawn on it, and the singing in the middle of the night. At the moment, it seems, there has been no substantial harm to our lives. But why is there a detailed notebook stored in the wooden floorboards? Could it possibly explain the connection between the strange occurrences in the house from the very beginning? I ultimately couldn't suppress my curiosity towards the unknown future, hidden deep within me as a human being. A vague fear affected my judgment. Those on the surface are always the hunters of the truth. As long as you've confirmed the truth's existence, whether or not it is eventually revealed, humans will unconsciously immerse themselves in the fear of such darkness. The only difference is how deeply fear has infiltrated each person. I need to figure it out. If possible, it would be best to bury those strange phenomena together in the reality. With such a goal in mind, I chose a weekend to follow Mr. Dono's earlier instructions, and went to the University of California Library to investigate the rare collection from Arkham University. Things did not go as smoothly as I had expected. After inquiring around with the staff there, I ended up with nothing. I was even almost mistaken for someone with a mental disorder, and was about to be expelled from the library. I don't know whether to call it luck or something else. In the library, I was like a headless chicken, searching through the vast sea of books. I ran into someone who seemed to be a student from the school, but he was a bit eccentric. He claimed to be Du Abu Muhammad. He is an exchange student from an Arab university. He is currently majoring in mysticism of the Near East, and the study of the folklore and symbols behind it. His fluency in English is surprisingly impressive, and he doesn't care whether I believe or take an interest in his mysticism. He simply begins telling me his bizarre theories about what he believes to be the darkness, which he considers to be the truth, and the so-called great connection with the darkness. I let my brain enter standby mode, so I could listen to him in a relatively polite state, while he rambled on endlessly. Although deep down, I was thinking, if this person were to fall into hell, I wonder if he'd be able to endure the torture of having his tongue cut out. Finally, he seemed to notice my embarrassment and confusion. He stopped talking. "Sir, if you don't believe my intuition, why would I have found you here?" His slightly hoarse, yet magnetic voice restarted the thinking process in my brain. Du Abu could see that I was finally showing some interest. Softly, "You brought up something that truly unsettled me. Sir, I seem to sense that you have a desire to explore the collection in a library. But I would advise you, after all, you are still in the surface world of reality. I truly do not recommend that you touch upon things that might completely overturn everything you know as a human. Forbidden knowledge." I naturally didn't listen to his words. Even if it were Mr. Godfrey, you would probably feel the same way, wouldn't you? But behind his words, there seemed to be a series of mad acts attempting to surpass human understanding and senses, and after being drawn into it, those results led me to think rationally and completely negatively. But at the same time, I also smelled a breakthrough in the investigation. I asked Duabu if I could have more access to the library's collection. He nodded in agreement. He said he did have, but because he couldn't go there frequently, the next time I go to the library, it will be postponed to next week. He said that as long as I agree to let him borrow my house to conduct a period of esoteric research, and complete the writing on some of the esoteric history related to his future work, and if we can uncover some truths, maybe we can also properly deal with the visions in my house. Clearly, this is the closest opportunity to the truth, and it is definitely an offer that's hard to refuse. I told myself deep down, as long as he remains honest, it is absolutely worth taking on the risks of the unknown. After a struggle within myself, I agreed to do Abu Muhammad's terms. But as a reciprocal condition, I also to apply to your University of California for an official research application and the corresponding documents to prove my identity. He readily agreed. So, we exchanged contact information, and this young Arab man named Du Abu, he had indeed prepared the documents I requested. About a week later, he came with several heavy books and a bag that seemed to contain items for some sort of ritual. He arrived near my house. Of course, I didn't want to let little Kuki. I had been in contact with more and more people from foreign backgrounds involved with mysticism. As a result, before Dua Abu Muhammad arrived at my house, I sent little Kuji to his grandparents' house to spend his 10-week summer vacation there. This meant that, the coming days, it was the moment when the two of us were about to touch and explore the unspeakable taboo. It was the time for us to engage with it. The moment Duab Muhammad arrived at my house, despite having mentally prepared myself, I could still see his astonishment when he first stepped into the house, surprised by the room full of arrow symbols on my side. As I had previously explained to Mr. Dono, I once again recounted what had happened earlier. The various strange phenomena encountered in the house were explained to Duaibu. I also mentioned that day the conversation I had with Mr. Dono. After listening to my account, he thought for a moment. Then, he asked me for some of my notes on the arrow and my drawings of little Kuki. That's all. As a witness, I have already provided all the information I can to Dua. And this young man, although just an Arab studying the occult, doesn't seem to hide much of his findings and conclusions in his research. I turned a small room in the attic into a simple research lab. For a long time afterward, Duab stayed in this place, conducting his secret research. For almost a week, he, like me, witnessed what was happening in the completely locked house. New arrows appeared out of nowhere. Occasionally, short figures would appear in the room. At midnight, a strange lullaby, sung to the tune of Snow Lotus, could be heard. I once asked Duabu if there were any stories about those strange children. Duabu also said that he was currently unable to confirm anything. Although he did say he had experienced it in the house, he felt an unprecedented sense of eerie strangeness. It seemed to be a contact and sensation beyond human understanding, although he quickly recalled the Necronomicon and the Arab madman, Abd al-Azrid, who praised the great old one Cthulhu, and the mental sensations it brought. But it's also somewhat different. Although through one's own spirit, one can see, through a layer of inexpressible mist, a vast and absurd land of nothingness, and also a boundless ocean, emitting an eerie green light. But these scenes don't seem to belong to that distant, ancient past. It doesn't belong to the era when the great old ones ruled the world, and the world was desolate. This makes him uneasy. Through my observations and records, along with his observations over the past few days, he has reinforced his conclusion. He told me that there is indeed an unspeakable presence in the room. In the house, the increasing number of arrows confirms its existence. And excluding my previous records, besides the color changes, quantitatively speaking, if that existence were acting secretly, the number of arrows on the wall would also increase. This also indirectly shows the drawing of arrows. It suggests that our guy is also nervous and uneasy. Duab confirmed my earlier assumption about the arrow. The inference is related to those strange children, and I think this seems to be slowly growing and attempting to act. This being should be Pasadi, the Great Union. He asked me if I believed that the universe began and ended in chaos. If I believed, then I could connect the children singing in the dead of night with the ugly, flute-playing creatures beside the chaotic and ignorant master. This was all to appease that extremely dangerous and nauseating master. Although Pusadi is far from being considered an outer god to him, the difference is still vast. However, the dimension he resides in has already far surpassed the human brain's understanding of this kind of information. If we really have to make a simple comparison, from a perspective that humans can understand, you could think of Pusadi as having the perspective of our dimension. It's like a person peering into a bacterium. You can then begin to understand the vast gap in power between it and our current civilization. Fortunately, because of those children, Pusodi is still in a dormant state. We don't know if those children will be able to traverse human time to maintain his slumber. But if one day, one of the countless millions of gazes of Pusodi notices human civilization, perhaps that part of Pusodi belonging to our dimension will awaken. It will destroy the entire world filled with humans. I can sense it. This Arab. His face gradually showed uncontrolled panic and fear. Duab warned me. Although Pusodi was dormant, it was in an amorphous state. If we count from the time when Mr. Dano excavated the giant stone and cut it open, Pusodi should have grown from an imperceptible size After 30 years of growth, it has already reached the size of this house. And this is still just the perspective we, as three-dimensional humans, are able to see. Perhaps Pusodi has already grown to a point where it can extend its repulsive tentacles and claws into dimensions and spaces beyond our comprehension. These words undoubtedly increased my anxiety. It wasn't because I completely believed Due Abu Muhammad's series of claims that struck me as fantastical and improbable. Although I might not be a completely staunch materialist, but my skepticism towards mysticism, it only reaches the level of demonic ghosts. But his words inevitably remind me of what Mr. Dono said about that mad semiotics professor. As Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. My subconscious seems to be hinting at me, if I continue to delve into those secrets hidden in the darkness, he will be the next mad professor, a tragic carbon copy. I don't know why either. For this groundless premonition, I choose once again to deny it. I neither revealed my suspicions, nor did I therefore incriminate this young man, evicted from my house. Duab Muhammad, a UC exchange student, an Arab versed in occultism, spent the next 8 weeks compiling his work on the history of occultism. For most of the day, he shut himself away in the attic of my house. Reason lies in the countless lightless abysses of the universe. The dark secrets. I occasionally see him walk down from the attic to the kitchen, taking food out of the fridge. During this, there is always a gesture of looking up at the clock. He even sometimes takes the clock off the wall, fiddling with the clock, saying that the time seems to be malfunctioning. Every time I see this scene, it's like looking at something from over 40 years ago, like those outdated stories in old science fiction magazines. I can't help but laugh. Or maybe the clock in the hall is broken. Time, a thing that moves in a straight line. How could it possibly experience anomalies so easily? But this behavior is within the range I can accept. I can sense Duab's mental state is clearly deteriorating day by day. He occasionally murmurs some indescribable incantations, and at times seems to be pleading in Arabic for divine forgiveness and redemption, often accompanied by a long period of prayer. Sometimes, he would at night utter inhuman, terrifying roars from his mouth. He would murmur some nauseating, unnameable blasphemies. This severely affected my mental state, and exacerbated my psychological problems. Many times, I even wanted to scream and roar to drive it away. Or, I took the knife for cutting meat and chopping bones from the kitchen, and intended to kill him completely, but I didn't do it. It seemed like my subconscious was in fear, afraid of the existence that this Arab man was trying to uncover. Maybe it was a hallucination. I could always feel the presence of people moving around my house. It was just that. They are no longer the 7 children who once sang. Instead, they are a group of towering figures, carrying malice, unsettling to behold. Or perhaps these shadows will merge together and form a terrifying specter made of various limbs, mixed together into a horrific afterimage. My reason tells me that this is simply a result of your deteriorating mental state. I had a hallucination. In my mind, these words mingled with some of my confused memories, blending together. They formed a consciousness that seemed unfamiliar to me, but the community doctor in Pamian gave me advice and warnings, as well as a prescription. It's all dense, illegible script. I can't understand what it refers to as future medicine. Children, when they encounter a frog or insect on the road, might be curious about such small things. They wouldn't ignore them outright like adults, or mercilessly send them to their death. Instead, they would take a childlike approach. They are given attention until the sound of parents calling them home appears, which forces them to leave. As for those insignificant creatures, they are either taken back to the house and live in a specially made cage, or they die at the hands of adults who lack understanding. Either way, it is just that the children lose interest in it. From then on, what happens to them is no longer something that children should be interested in. I don't know where those foreign children went. I don't know when. It seems like we never heard children's songs again. Maybe it's really those tall adults, standing in a space and dimension that cannot be directly viewed. He called them back home. It was precisely because of Duab's words that their disappearance often meant that the house, that twisted madness, may have already awakened. Duab Muhammad. That young Arab man. He seemed to be gradually losing the rationality required not only as a researcher, but even as a human being. I need to be cautious of him. The things he says are becoming increasingly difficult to understand. It's probably because he's finished that historical work, which has caused him to completely lose his mind. Duab is no longer like he was 8 weeks ago, openly sharing his research findings with me. He hardly bothers with his hair anymore. The large patch of reddish-brown beard on his face, in the midst of tangled underbrush, was paired with eyes that were bloodshot from severe lack of rest. The frequency of our conversations dropped dramatically. It was as if he was restraining himself to the utmost. It seemed he had a secret he couldn't share. When he wanted to confide in me, fear would quickly swallow the words back down. I try to point to the location of the refrigerator as much as possible, in order to avoid buying raw meat as much as possible, also because he seems to confuse the food that a normal person's stomach can tolerate. In addition, he seems to be deliberately avoiding the arrows on those houses, even going so far as to use various liquid coatings to conceal these arrows. Of course, I put away all the knives in the kitchen, hiding them under the nightstand in my room. What I didn't know was that something beyond my 5 senses was screaming wildly, telling me that danger seemed to be getting closer. But we were trapped in an inescapable, hopeless situation. Until the final week, the remaining sanity that is gradually being worn down is still holding on to the last control over my actions. I probably have about a week left to clean up this messy house, to remove this seemingly crazy Arab from my house. Then I'll arrange a long-term loan and leave this house as much as possible. I had planned everything with my last bit of sanity. But first, I needed to head to the attic of the house to explain everything to him. When I climbed up, I realized that Duabu seemed to have completely destroyed the arrangement in the attic, including the incandescent bulbs used for lighting. In the vast darkness, I heard Duabu's voice, filled with extreme fear. He was trembling, doing his best to control his panic, warning me in a normal human voice. The gaze of Pusodi has already fallen on the moment we are in. But this, it wasn't what the higher beings who created Pusodi expected. He discovered a door in his meditation, a door that doesn't exist in our space, and that unearthed 30 years ago might be a unique medium for accessing and understanding that door. He said, and suddenly let out a horrific, soul-piercing scream. It was then that I was suddenly jolted awake, realizing that in the darkness, there were countless hostile, long-watching, and incomprehensible mysterious forces. Everything erupted at an unexpected moment. That poor young Arab, in the final moments of his life, in a death that bordered on madness. He, with only half a body left, crawled before me. He offered me the 2 books still clutched in his arms, placing them in my hands. My instincts told me I had to leave immediately. My hands frantically searched in the darkness. I finally found an escape route. My subconscious delivered a message of despair to me. Duab Muhammad, the young Arab who devoted himself to studying mysticism, was crushed in a mysterious space that he could never understand, even in death. And I could receive his final message through human hearing. It was Duabu, hoarse and desperate, calling out the names of his family in Arabic, and pleading with his Lord for forgiveness. Then came the inhuman cries and howls of agony. That surely was a fate more terrifying than death. During my escape, I missed a step on the stairs, and smashed my head open. Although I've regained a little bit of my composure, but my body is still experiencing a strong adverse reaction to the incomprehensible images I just saw. I have a terrible headache. My head is splitting. The floor seems to be covered with my vomit and excrement. I struggled to get up. I was thinking of finding the house phone. I hoped the phone would work, that someone would come to my rescue. The reality exceeded my expectations. The house's communication equipment seemed to have been destroyed by a man named Ludensno. It was destroyed. The biggest mistake of his life. He accepted his wife's divorce and concealed his own psychological issues. He brought his child into this ominous house. In the end, a chain of consequences led to the tragedy. Perhaps the best medicine for treating that man's mental illness was, it's the future medicine. I tried to alert my neighbors by shouting for help. But in the end, only Mr. Masalatrulli found me. However, he took the book from my arms. Later, what happened to Mr. Masalatrulli seems to have only one witness. Me, who knows the real reason for his disappearance. My neighbor actually heard Lutton Snow's cry for help. But he didn't offer any assistance. It was simply because he was the very witness Mr. Donovan mentioned years ago, in the strange church incident. My neighbor was just a poor, unrelated mortal, caught up in a quiet and peaceful night. Awakened by the call from the depths of a nightmare. Through the window, he saw a massive church made of various dark, twisted stones, rising more than 10,000 feet high. Not only that, but through the church's dark windows, he saw eerie, distorted shadows passing by. Lightning flashed across the sky, and when the lightning struck, a giant figure with an octopus head and bat wings appeared in the sky. He was also driven to severe mental illness because of it. These images later became his terrifying secret that, even in the face of mental torment, he would not speak of. The Dhuab that died in his house. His body spoke again. The only special medium to touch that dark door was the giant stone mined 30 years ago. So, I desperately ran toward that giant stone that had just been cut. Although, what others saw was just an empty interior. From an invisible perspective, it seemed different. That stone's interior is a metaphor for Psodi's birth and return. And for touching that dark door of his. I was about to touch the dark truth. It's all my fault, thanks to my nosy colleague. And that damn Dono, the person in charge. But I was also lucky enough. As long as I can give my vision. The 7 children of miracles born in Psodi. I can also proudly become a part of the Great Union. My house has become extremely unfamiliar. At this moment, it has transcended the 3-dimensional space, to be restructured. Inside the house, things that were originally concealed by Duabu, have all peeled away. The drawings on the wall resemble a network of capillaries. With colored pens, or colored condiments, arrows are drawn. They are stretched and twisted, following the direction the arrows point to, towards an empty space. In an image space that I cannot understand. Those arrows eventually outline a near 3-dimensional, but distorted and enormous figure. That is the Great Union. A powerful and terrifying existence on par with the ancient rulers. Aside from that, it seems my house has been broken into countless fragments of images, connected in another space I cannot comprehend. Including the ceiling above my head. It's as if the images failed to load. It became something that seemed transparent. And it seemed to be something of infinite darkness. The moon cast a light almost as dazzling as the sun above me. Through countless tiny gaps in space. It became a scattering of light and shadow like cookie crumbs on the ground, countless invisible eyes, imbued with human thought, focused on me. I, too, seemed to become almost omniscient. I can see images of the kitchen. My clock is constantly running backward. Space and time have been completely overturned. Perhaps there are beings or objects, but they don't have a fixed form, volume, or mass. But they seem to be what were once human. Ugly, dirty, dull, and insane. These bizarre and fantastical things ultimately destroyed my sanity, and completely damaged my brain. I deeply regret that I still haven't seen Pujot's true face. Because I am just a human with insignificant power. Images cannot help me understand his existence, and he didn't even notice the existence of someone as insignificant as me, even though he has hundreds and thousands of ways to perceive things. I finally found a path that seems to lead to a pitch-black church. Through the bones of countless races, piled up behind a massive wall, I have finally walked into this, seemingly comprehensible by human reason, lightless, blasphemous cathedral. I have spent what feels like an eternity, interpreting the endless stairways and the bas-reliefs that once recorded history. Human history seems so long. The colossal tower of civilization. It took thousands of years to slowly build it, yet it crumbled in just a few days. By the time I reached the top floor, my body and consciousness were corrupted. But I did not vanish into nothingness in this timeless expanse. I finally reached the top of this tall tower. Following a few dim, it emitted a light that didn't belong to any color in the Earth's spectrum. It also seemed like something from an oil lamp. I saw a pitch-black throne with a strange and twisted aesthetic. Sitting on it was a figure, seemingly like an Egyptian pharaoh, with a jet-black silhouette. It surprised me. He actually understands all the languages flowing through all dimensions in the cosmos, including the language I speak. His voice was dull and monotonous, but carried a terrifyingly profound power. It gave one the feeling of a mad but rational, supreme intellect. I felt his guidance. He walked up to me. I watched him open two yellowed books. He spoke to me in English, saying, "In the year 730 AD, an Arab madman named Abd al-Asrad wrote the Necronomicon. More than 1,200 years later, a man named Duabu Muhammad, also a madman from Arabia, drew inspiration from the Necronomicon. From divination, saw a future that transcended time and space, and thus wrote Echoes of the Day After Tomorrow. This book contains records of the Great United Psoti. In human history, the ancient rulers are awakening, and time returns to descend upon this world. The calendar becomes meaningless, and reason dissolves into vapor. It lies silent within the civilized world, once hiding in the dark corners. The cultists who worshipped the ancient rulers now return to the surface. The ancient palace rises from the sea, in the dark and silent years, once again covering the land and sky. Extreme worshippers become the standard for human behavior. The survivors seek a corner of space that cannot be understood. In this bizarre and twisted space, they built this towering, pitch-black cathedral. After enduring an indescribable length of time, it eventually evolved into higher dimensions, becoming the great race known as the Psoti. From then on, nightmares and madness became entertainment. Understanding beyond madness itself became the constant sensation of the future Psoti, born out of malice and hostility toward the ancient rulers. They are dedicated to finding the ultimate power that can balance the ancient rulers, to return to Earth and reclaim this world. Thus, amidst the procession of the world, I discovered the Psoti within this tower. I witnessed the unimaginable, terrifying miracles that I had demonstrated. A part of them devoutly became my followers. From the indescribable gate of darkness, they glimpsed the throne of Azathoth, and from the abyss of cosmic darkness, in the depths of a forest with no greenery, they overheard the unspeakable secrets of Shabnigoth. On a date not recorded in history, the Psoti tribe, from within their own race, followed a 7-day week system to reproduce with other ancient races. They gave birth to 7 beings known as the Sons of Miracle. They were part of the earliest Great Union. Later, deep in the hidden chambers beneath the church, the 7 Sons of Miracle sacrificed on the hidden altar in the secret chamber. The Great Alliance of Psoti was born in the dark, lightless forest ruled by Shabani Nicholas, a vast, pitch-black, and profound void. Thus, the Psoti clan found the giant stone that recorded the time of the apocalypse. They sealed Psoti within the stone, along with the 7 children of the miracles, into the reversal of time, sleeping until the return of the old ones to the world, to quickly return to the rapid downfall of the old world, then to that endless, sunless apocalypse, when the old ones return to the world once again. And then the great ones will awaken in the dark corners of time. Opening the gate of darkness, the power of the robe will remold the order of the apocalypse. At that time, the calendar will be reconstructed. Humanity will also take Psoti as the new god, replacing the old beliefs. I was astonished by this, asking the pharaoh before me why he was willing to reveal these almost unbelievable ultimate secrets. He informed me. He didn't answer. He knew very well. Before becoming Pusati, humans were purely rational animals. Even if I could return to that real world, and inform the whole world, they wouldn't believe me. They just saw me as a complete madman. That's why, when humanity is plunged into endless nightmares and madness, being able to bring oneself pleasure. After he told me all this, accompanied by a silent flash of lightning, his figure disappeared in the brief white light. Then, my human reason and senses are quickly recovering. Soon, a series of chilling whispers resonates in my ears, accompanied by the nauseating sound of joints cracking. It pierces my eardrums. The fear from deep within me quickly takes control of my reason. In those humanoid giant monsters, from an incomprehensible space, a tear opened up. Before it lunged at me, the only thing I remember is running desperately. Even though I had several broken bones. But thankfully, my legs could still run. In the endless terrifying darkness, and amidst the maddening screams and roars, I lost consciousness. Until I woke up again, I was already bound by straps and bandages, tied up in the intensive care unit of a California state hospital. In between that, I have no idea how or from where I managed to escape. People found me again. I have multiple fractures. My body almost died from the excessive burden. Because body parts were found in my house. And because of the Arab man's blood tissue found on me, I'm bound by a false accusation. Even my lawyer doesn't want to believe my statement. The key evidence that would prove my innocence doesn't exist in the wall paneling mentioned in the letter from the previous tenant, Mr. Maculator. The FBI forensics team, following the instructions in the letter, sawed open the walls of my house, but found nothing. In the end, the verdict was, because of my psychiatric evaluation, I was confined to a local California mental health treatment center, more than 500 meters from the Pamir community. Coincidentally, I was placed in the room where it said that Professor Foam, the serial killer, was held 30 years ago. The treatment center's environment is quite good, except when night falls each day. Those memories, terrifying to the point I don't want to recall them, crawl into my mind in the form of nightmares. For this reason, I drink coffee, or energy drinks more and more frequently, to maintain a high frequency of shallow sleep every day, to maintain my ability to avoid understanding again, that maddening, the strangely collapsing space. I requested watercolors from the treatment center. That way, when those dense arrows appear again in my ward, and all point at me, the doctors at the treatment center won't make any further assumptions. As long as I don't engage in any threatening behavior, those staff members were very tolerant of me. They would even regularly send cleaning staff into the ward to help me clean up those unsettling arrows that destabilized my emotions. Compared to before me, Mr. Makaratu, who had already become part of the Great Union, that Arab, Duabu Muhammad, and the one who went mad because of the giant rock. Later, I dismembered myself in the hospital, professor of semiotics. I'd say my ending was quite fulfilling. I don't think there's any need to announce it to the world. It's unknown how many years after our deaths the apocalypse will occur. I'm only extremely worried about my child, Yunjing. That is, little Kuji. I can't imagine how a child would face, after summer vacation, that utterly filthy, blood-stained and gloomy new home. And that biological father, who everyone says is insane and killed someone. I also don't know if my child would be tempted to touch the Great Union. Because of those so-called miracle children, the forbidden secret behind Puswoti. Because of such concerns, I have seen my child many times while falling into hallucinations, seen my child chanting an evil language I couldn't understand, singing that strange ballad in a bizarre tone. Every time this happened, I would lose a whole day's sleep. At midnight, listen carefully to the next room. Those seem to be curse-like whispers, accompanied by roars from afar, and the eerie sounds of limbs contorting. My dear Mr. Godfrey, when you see this, I think there must be a house in the Pamian community that has been sealed off for a long time. rational civilizations are unwilling to believe me, and dare not face the terrifying secrets behind the world. It is even more impossible for them to destroy that ominous monolith, because of my undeniable encounter. I don't know if you believe the events I described in my letter, or go to the house yourself to verify. I don't advise you to go to that house, especially at night, a time suitable for gatherings of evil secrets. Perhaps you'll find figures of wildly disproportionate size and height, or perhaps the twisted, incomprehensible shadows within the house. Perhaps you will block those messages that disrupt the peaceful tranquility of the Pamian community. After everything is cleared up, arrange for a new resident to move in. If everything happens, please inform the new resident never to climb up to that attic at night. To avoid Duab, the spirit of Muhammad whispers terrifying secrets from beyond dimensions, leading others once again to touch that invisible door of evil. Ludun Snow. Written in California. September 27, 2012. More. More.